The Transistor Radio Wars, Hilarious History to Fall Asleep. By Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Death of the Mahogany Monster. Man is the only animal that will voluntarily bring a 300-pound piece of furniture into his home for the express purpose of being insulted by it. I have observed many forms of human folly, from the belief that a mustache makes a scoundrel look like a statesman to the conviction that a riverboat pilot is a creature of God's own making. But nothing quite matches the era of the Mahogany Monster. In the midsection of this stumbling century, the radio was not a mere appliance. It was an occupying force. It was a massive, hulking edifice of polished wood and vainglorious intentions known as the console. It sat in the corner of the parlor with the brooding, silent authority of a Victorian grandmother who has just discovered a playing card in the family Bible. It was constructed of mahogany so dark and heavy that it seemed to have its own gravitational pull, attracting dust, lace doilies, and the terrified respect of every child within a 3-mile radius. To own a radio in those years was to enter into a solemn, one-sided contract with a beast that demanded the primary real estate of the household. It did not move. It could not move. If you had attempted to shift the Mahogany Monster 6 inches to the left, to better catch the evening light, you would have required a team of mules, a hydraulic jack, and a permit from the local architectural board. It was a stationary monument to the unseen. It suggested that if God had intended for man to hear music, he had also intended for man to stay exactly where he was told until the music was finished. The inner workings of this behemoth were a mystery of the highest and most expensive order. It was powered by what were called vacuum tubes, glass bottles of varying shapes and sizes that looked like the discarded laboratory equipment of a madman. These tubes were filled with nothingness, which is a commodity that has always been remarkably easy to sell to the public at a high price. When you approached the monster to engage its services, you did not simply turn it on. You performed a ritual. You grasped a heavy brass knob, an affair that felt as though it were connected to the rudder of a steamship, and you gave it a deliberate twist. Then you waited. This was the warm-up period. It was a time for reflection, for quiet prayer, and for the radio to decide whether it felt like cooperating or whether it would prefer to spend the evening in a fit of electronic depression. As you stood there, the tubes inside would begin to glow with a sinister orange light. If you peered through the vents in the back, which smelled perpetually of singed dust, ozone, and the slow roasting of a trapped spider, you could see the tubes pulsing. It looked like a miniature city in the middle of a catastrophic power failure. Only when the glass had reached a temperature sufficient to fry an egg would the sound finally arrive. It did not start gently. It usually heralded its arrival with a crack of static so sharp and sudden it would startle the cat into a state of permanent nervous exhaustion and cause the elderly to believe the Great War had returned for an encore. But once the beast was awake, what a sound it produced! It was deep, resonant, and possessed the booming authority of a Supreme Court justice with a hangover. When the announcer spoke, his voice didn't just come out of the speaker. It emanated from the very floorboards. It was a communal experience, which is a polite way of saying it was a form of domestic tyranny. The entire family was required to gather around the monster in a semicircle of forced devotion. If Father wanted to listen to the news, the children sat in stony silence contemplating the inherent unfairness of the universe. If Mother wanted the opera, the menfolk stared at the carpet and practiced the art of sleeping, while appearing to be deeply moved by a soprano's high C. The radio dictated the geography of the home. You couldn't listen to a ball game in the kitchen while frying eggs. You had to choose between the nourishment of the body and the nourishment of the soul. To choose the ball game was to starve. To choose the eggs was to live in a state of agonizing ignorance regarding the score in the bottom of the ninth. The Mahogany monster was the sun, and we were merely the cold, damp planets orbiting its heavy gravity. It was a world governed by the length of a power cord and the fragility of a glass filament. And let us speak of those filaments. The real genius of the vacuum tube lay in its capacity for calculated betrayal. A tube is a creature of immense vanity. It will work perfectly for months, then choose the exact moment of a championship boxing match or a presidential address to expire with a faint pop and a smell of burnt hair. This would inevitably lead to the ritual of the tube tester. My neighbor, a man of more enthusiasm than mechanical sense, would dismantle the back of his radio, an operation involving more swearing than a Mississippi dockworkers' convention, and extract the offending glass bottles. He would then trek down to the local pharmacy, where a machine sat like a high-tech guillotine. You would plug your tubes into various holes, and a needle would swing between good, weak, and replace. It was the only form of gambling the local clergy overlooked, though I noticed the machine rarely leaned toward good when there was a sale on replace. We were convinced, in our simple-minded way, that this was the pinnacle of civilization. We believed that the larger the radio, the more truth it must contain. We assumed that music and news required a certain amount of physical weight and expensive woodwork to be taken seriously. If a message didn't come out of a mahogany box the size of a small barn, could it truly be called information? Then came the rumors of a solid-state device. Scientists at Bell Labs, men who clearly had no respect for the dignity of furniture, were tinkering with bits of silicon and germanium. They spoke of transistors. They promised a world where the vacuum was replaced by a crystal and the mahogany was replaced by plastic. We laughed, of course. How could a device the size of a deck of cards possibly capture the majesty of a symphony? How could something that ran on a mere battery, a portable lightning bolt, compete with the raw power of the Westinghouse electric grid? It was humbug. It was a parlor trick. It was as likely as a man flying to the moon or a lawyer admitting he was wrong on a Sunday. We sat by our mahogany monsters, basking in their warmth, smelling their toasted dust, and feeling secure in the knowledge that some things were simply too big to ever get small. We didn't realize that the monster was already a ghost. We didn't know that the age of the parlor was ending and the age of the pocket was about to begin. The transistor was coming, and it didn't care a lick about our joinery or our varnish. It was small, it was cheap, and it was about to turn the entire world into a cacophony of portable noise that would eventually drive every sane person to seek refuge in a silent cave. But that is the way of progress. It always starts with a miracle and ends with a headache. The mahogany monster didn't die all at once. It lingered for years, gathering doilies and dust, becoming a glorified stand for photographs of grandchildren who would never know the joy of waiting 3 minutes for a piece of glass to get hot enough to tell them the weather. It died because the world grew impatient. It died because we decided that being able to hear the news in the bathtub was more important than the dignity of a well-crafted cabinet. The first salvo was fired not with a bang, but with a tiny, tinny chirp from a device that looked like a pack of cigarettes and sounded like a hornet in a tin can. The war had begun, and the furniture was losing. Chapter 2. 3 Wise Men at Bell Labs. It has been my observation, gleaned from a lifetime of watching men attempt to outsmart Providence, that whenever 3 individuals of high intellect gather in a room to improve the human condition, the result is usually either a new tax or a device that makes a great deal of noise while accomplishing very little. History is littered with wise men of various denominations. Some followed a star to a manger, while others followed a slide rule to a patent office. The trio we are concerned with inhabited a sprawling antiseptic monastery of mathematics in New Jersey, known as Bell Labs. This was a place where the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the quiet, simmering desperation of men trying to prove that Mother Nature was, in fact, a series of avoidable errors that could be corrected with enough copper wire and stubbornness. In the year of our Lord 1947, the scientific community was still hopelessly enslaved to the vacuum tube. Now, I have already touched upon the moral failings of the vacuum tube, but it bears repeating. The device was a fraud. It was a fragile, glowing vanity, a glass bottle that pretended to be an intellectual while doing nothing more than turning expensive electricity into heat, and a small stuttering amount of signal. If you wanted to build a computer in those days, you needed a building the size of a tobacco warehouse and enough cooling fans to simulate a hurricane, lest the whole contraption melt into a puddle of molten glass and administrative regret. The vacuum tube was the pampered aristocrat of the electronic world. It required constant attention, a controlled climate, and had a tendency to expire the moment it was asked to do a lick of honest work. The high priests of this particular temple in New Jersey were William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Bratton. To look at them, you would not have suspected they were plotting the assassination of the furniture industry or the eventual downfall of domestic silence. They wore the uniform of the era with a grim, religious devotion. White shirts as stiff as a Sunday sermon, neckties that served no purpose other than to restrict the flow of oxygen to the brain, and expressions of such profound seriousness that you'd think they were personally responsible for keeping the moon in its orbit and the tides on their schedule. William Shockley was the visionary, which is a polite, historical way of saying he was the one who had the grand ideas and expected everyone else to do the heavy lifting without complaining. He was a man of immense intellect and a temperament that could peel the paint off a picket fence at 50 paces. He viewed the world as a series of equations that had been poorly solved by God, and he felt it was his personal duty to provide the corrections. Then there was John Bardeen, a quiet, contemplative soul who possessed the uncanny ability to see electrons moving through solids the way a veteran riverboat pilot sees the shifting sandbars and hidden snags of the Mississippi. While Shockley stormed the battlements of theory, Bardeen sat in the corner thinking, "This is always a dangerous sign in a laboratory." Finally, there was Walter Bratton, the man with the steady hands who actually had to make the confounded things work. He was the experimentalist, the tinkerer, the man who knew that nature does not give up her secrets to a man in a tie unless he is prepared to poke her with a stick. They were looking for the holy grail of electronics, the solid-state amplifier. They wanted a piece of rock, specifically germanium, a substance that sounds like it belongs in a Victorian tonic for nervous exhaustion, or perhaps a liniment for gout. To do the work of the vacuum tube, they wanted a crystal that could talk. Now, a crystal is a remarkably stubborn thing. It does not wish to be an amplifier, it wishes to be a rock. It has sat in the dark bowels of the earth for millions of years, perfectly content with its lot in life, only to be dug up by a man in a lab coat and told it must now carry the voice of a crooner, the price of pork bellies, or the results of a horse race. It is a transition that would make a saint swear. For months, these three wrestled with the stubbornness of matter. They poked at bits of germanium with gold foil. They bathed it in chemicals. They spoke to it in the arcane language of quantum mechanics, a dialect that makes a Missouri lawyer sound like a model of clarity and a font of transparent truth. They were looking for holes. In the topsy-turvy world of physics, a hole is not just a lack of something, it is a positive charge that moves around as if it were a real object. To a sensible man with a shovel, a hole is something you fall into or bury a dog in. To a physicist, a hole is a carrier of destiny. They spent their days chasing these invisible vacancies through the lattice of the crystal, trying to coax them into moving in a way that would turn a tiny whisper of electricity into a shout. The breakthrough occurred in December, a season usually reserved for more traditional, less electronic miracles. It was a cold, miserable month, the kind that makes a man grateful for a roaring fireplace and a bottle of something fortifying. Inside the lab, Brattain was tinkering with what we now call a point contact apparatus. It looked like a Rube Goldberg nightmare. Two tiny gold points pressed against a sliver of germanium, held together by a plastic wedge, some sealing wax, and a collective prayer. On the 23rd of December, they saw it. They fed a tiny signal in, and a larger signal came out. No glass, no vacuum, no 3-minute warm-up period, no heat enough to singe the eyebrows off a passing cat. Just a cold, silent piece of gray rock doing the work of a glowing giant. They had invented the transistor. They knew in that fleeting moment that they had done something momentous, though I doubt they realized they had just handed a loaded weapon to every teenager in the coming decades. Shockley, ever the diplomat, immediately began worrying about who would get the credit and how his name might be positioned in the annals of fame. Bardeen and Brattain, I suspect, were mostly relieved they didn't have to look at that particular piece of germanium ever again. They called in their superiors, demonstrated the device, and the room went silent. It was the silence of an era ending. The Mahogany monster, sitting in parlors across the nation, heard the news from afar through its wires and felt a sudden, inexplicable chill in its vacuum tubes. Of course, the world didn't find out right away. Science, like a good scandal or a bad case of the shingles, requires time to be properly packaged for the public. When Bell Labs finally held a press conference months later, the newspapers barely noticed. They tucked the story away on page 46, right next to the weather report, a column on the virtues of beet farming, and an advertisement for a miraculous cure for hog cholera. The public couldn't understand why they should care about a triode made of solid material. It wasn't shiny. It didn't glow. You couldn't even see it without a magnifying glass and a great deal of patience. But the wise men knew. They had shrunk the invisible. They had taken the vast, hot, sprawling world of electronics and compressed it into something that could be hidden in the palm of a hand. They had taken the soul of the radio, the ability to catch voices out of the thin air, and stripped it of its mahogany dignity. I imagine Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain standing there in their lab, looking at that tiny, ugly little scrap of metal and plastic. They thought they were building a better telephone system. They thought they were helping the military calculate the trajectory of a cannonball with greater efficiency. They had no idea they were actually inventing a way for a 14-year-old girl to ignore her grandmother's advice while listening to a man named Elvis howl about his domestic troubles with a hound dog. They were the three wise men indeed. They brought the gift of the transistor to the world, and like most gifts of great power, it arrived without an instruction manual on how to handle the sheer volume of noise it would eventually produce. They had liberated the radio from the parlor, but in doing so, they had ensured that silence would henceforth become the most expensive and rarest commodity on the face of the earth. As they left the lab that night, I like to think the ghost of a vacuum tube flickered one last time in a console somewhere in Newark, a faint, dying ember of the old world, sensing that the reign of the mahogany monster was about to be cut short by a piece of rock and three men who were far too clever for their own health. The first salvo had been fired in the laboratory. The next would be fired in the marketplace, and it would be wrapped in a coat of plastic and sold for $49.95. The solid-state revolution was no longer a theory, it was a fact. And, as I have often remarked, a fact is a very stubborn thing, especially when it's small enough to fit in your pocket and loud enough to wake the dead and irritate the living. The world was about to get a whole lot smaller and a whole lot noisier, and we had three men in New Jersey to thank for the headache. Chapter 3. The Regency TR-1, the first salvo. It has been my observation that the human race is never quite so industrious as when it is trying to find a way to avoid its own company. For centuries, the domestic hearth was the center of the universe, primarily because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but stare at one's relatives until the impulse to commit arson became a genuine theological concern. Then came the mahogany monster, which at least gave the family something to stare at besides each other's lengthening faces. But even the monster had a flaw. It was anchored to the wall. It required a parlor. It demanded a physical presence. Man, in his infinite restlessness, decided this would not do. He desired to be annoyed by the news while standing in a cow pasture. He wished to hear a symphony while hiding in the potting shed. He wanted, in short, to take the noise with him. And so, in the year of our Lord 1954, the first shot was fired in a revolution that would eventually leave the world's ears ringing and its pockets significantly lighter. This was the Regency TR-1. If the vacuum tube was the bloated monarch of the airwaves, the TR-1 was the scrawny, plastic-clad assassin sent to slit its throat in the middle of the night. The TR-1 was the offspring of an unlikely marriage between a company called Texas Instruments, who provided the brains, and a firm known as IDEA, which operated under the name Regency. For the same reason, a common swindler calls himself a colonel. It sounded grander than the reality. Texas Instruments had figured out how to mass-produce those little germanium nuggets we call transistors. But they didn't know what to do with them. They approached the major radio manufacturers, the titans who built the Mahogany cathedrals, and were told to take their little pebbles and go play in the dirt. The titans weren't interested in making things smaller. They sold wood, they sold weight, and they sold the status of a 300-pound cabinet. But Regency was small, hungry, and possessed that peculiar brand of American madness that believes if you make something small enough to be lost in a coat pocket, people will pay a king's ransom for the privilege of losing it. When the TR-1 finally emerged from the womb of the factory, it was a sight to behold, if you happen to enjoy the aesthetic of a pack of cigarettes that has been to university. It was 3 inches wide, 5 inches high, and 1.25 inches thick. It weighed less than a pound. To a man accustomed to a radio that required a structural engineer to install, this was not just a marvel. It was a blasphemy. It was as if someone had handed you a horse that could be folded up and placed in your hat. The price, however, was not small. It was priced at $49.95. In those days, $50 was a substantial sum, the kind of money that could buy you a respectable cow, a decent suit of clothes, or a very long and enthusiastic weekend in New Orleans. For $50, you were purchasing 4 transistors, a few bits of wire, and a plastic shell that came in colors like mandarin red, cloud gray, and jade green. I have always found that when a manufacturer starts talking about jade green, they are trying to distract you from the fact that the object in question doesn't work particularly well. The TR-1 was a masterpiece of marketing and a catastrophe of acoustics. To turn it on was to invite a very small, very angry hornet into your immediate vicinity. The sound did not emanate. It escaped. It was tinny, shrill, and lacked any semblance of what we used to call bass. If the Mahogany monster sounded like the voice of God, the Regency TR-1 sounded like the voice of a very nervous chipmunk shouting through a comb and a piece of wax paper. It had one tiny speaker that struggled to convey the majesty of a full orchestra, usually settling for a sound reminiscent of a bag of silverware falling down a flight of stairs. Furthermore, the TR-1 was powered by a 22.5-volt battery. Now, a battery of that denomination was not something you found at the local corner store next to the peppermint sticks. It was a specialized, expensive little brick that had the life expectancy of a mayfly. You could listen to a couple of ball games and a few hours of jazz, and then the radio would begin to groan. The signal would fade into a pathetic whimper, and you would be out another $2 for a fresh battery. It was a marvelous machine for transferring money from the pockets of the public into the vaults of the battery makers. But did the public care? They did not. They were enchanted. The TR-1 represented something far more dangerous than music. It represented autonomy. For the first time in human history, the teenager could leave the parlor. He could take his noise box, as the elders rightly called it, up to his bedroom or out to the garage or into the back of a Chevrolet and listen to whatever unholy rhythm he desired without the supervising glare of his father. It was the beginning of the lonely crowd. It was the first step toward a world where every human being sits in a private bubble of sound, disconnected from his neighbor, nodding his head to a beat that no one else can hear. The TR-1 was the first salvo in the war against shared experience. It promised that you could have the world in your pocket, forgetting that once you put the world in your pocket, you no longer have to look it in the eye. The industry titans, seeing the TR-1, laughed at first. They pointed out the poor sound quality. They mocked the plastic casing. They noted that it couldn't pull in a station from more than 20 miles away without sounding like a hailstorm on a tin roof. They were right, of course. They were perfectly, logically, and hilariously right. But they forgot one fundamental truth about the human animal. We will always choose a convenient lie over a heavy truth. The Mahogany monster was the truth. It was solid, it was beautiful, and it sounded magnificent. The TR-1 was the convenient lie. It was cheap-looking, it sounded like a whistle, but it was there, in your hand, while you were walking down the street. The success of the TR-1 was modest by modern standards. They sold maybe 100,000 units, but its impact was like a spark in a hayloft. It proved that the transistor was not just a laboratory curiosity for the wise men in New Jersey, it was a consumer's toy. It proved that the public was willing to sacrifice every bit of musical fidelity for the sake of portability. It also caught the eye of a few gentlemen in Japan, men who were currently making small, unremarkable things and looking for a way to make them very, very remarkable. They saw the TR-1 and didn't see a pack of cigarettes that sang. They saw the future. They saw that the Americans had invented the weapon, but they hadn't quite figured out how to aim it yet. So the TR-1 sits in history as a sort of glorious failure, a pioneer that was eaten by the very wilderness it tried to tame. It was the first, but it would not be the best. It was the crack in the dam. Behind it, a flood of plastic and germanium was gathering, ready to wash away the parlor, the console, and the very idea that music was something you sat down to respect. I remember seeing a man with one of these devices shortly after they debuted. He was holding it to his ear with an expression of intense concentration, looking for all the world like he was listening to a secret from the Sphinx. I asked him what he was hearing. "The news," he said, beaming with pride. "And is it good news?" I asked. "I can't tell," he replied. "I can only hear every third word, but I'm hearing it while I'm walking my dog. Can you believe it?" I could believe it. I could also believe that within 50 years we would all be walking our dogs in a state of total electronic deafness, oblivious to the world around us, all because we couldn't stand the thought of being alone with our own thoughts for the length of a city block. The Regency TR-1 was the end of silence, and we paid $50 a head for the privilege. Chapter 4. The Japanese Contender. If there is one thing an American enjoys more than inventing a thing, it is the quiet, smug satisfaction of believing that no one else on God's green earth could possibly understand how it works. We have a peculiar national conviction that while the rest of the world may be capable of growing decent grapes or weaving intricate carpets, the business of tinkering with the invisible forces of the universe is a strictly Yankee pastime. We invented the lightning rod, the telephone, and the light bulb, and we assumed that the transistor, that little sliver of New Jersey rock, would remain as American as a fraudulent land claim or a contested election. We were, as is often the case with such convictions, magnificently wrong. While we were busy patting ourselves on the back for the Regency TR-1, which, as I have noted, sounded like a chorus of crickets with laryngitis. A group of gentlemen in Japan were looking at our little pocket radio with a terrifying level of concentration. These were the men of Tokyo Sushin Kogyo, a name that rolls off the tongue with the grace of a sack of coal falling down a staircase. For the sake of global sanity and the printing of labels, they eventually shortened it to Sony. Now, the word Sony is a curious thing. It was derived from sonus, the Latin word for sound, and sunny, an Americanism for a bright young lad. It was a name designed to sound friendly, modern, and, most importantly, vaguely Western. It was a verbal camouflage. They wanted a name that an American could say without feeling like his jaw was about to unhinge. It was the first sign that we were being outmaneuvered, not just by science, but by a superior understanding of human vanity. The leaders of this enterprise, Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuka, were not the sort of men to be intimidated by the fact that their country was currently a graveyard of industrial dreams. They possessed that most dangerous of human traits, a lack of respect for the impossible. They looked at the American transistor and didn't see a miracle. They saw a rough draft. They saw that the Americans had treated the transistor like a novelty, a toy to be sold in Mandarin red to people with $50 to burn. Morita and Ibuka decided that if the transistor was going to rule the world, it needed to be more than a toy. It needed to be a tool, and it needed to be small, not American small, which is to say slightly smaller than a bread box, but actually small. The Japanese had a natural advantage in this war of miniaturization. You see, an American's idea of space is influenced by the Great Plains and the vast, sprawling reaches of the West. We build things big because we have plenty of room to put them. A Japanese man's idea of space is influenced by the fact that he lives on a crowded island where every square inch is contested by either a mountain, a neighbor, or a rice paddy. They were experts at living small. They were a civilization of poets who could fit a whole philosophy into 17 syllables. It was only natural they should be the ones to fit a whole orchestra into a shirt pocket. But first, they had to deal with the germanium. The American transistors were notoriously temperamental. They had a yield rate that would make a gambler weep. Out of every 100 transistors produced, maybe 5 were fit for human company. The rest were merely expensive grit. The Sony engineers, however, attacked the problem with a persistence that bordered on the theological. They didn't just want a transistor that worked, they wanted one that worked every time. They treated the germanium like a stubborn child, coaxing it, cleaning it, and whispering to it until it behaved. In 1955, they produced the TR-55, Japan's first transistor radio. It was a respectable effort, but it wasn't the knockout blow. That came 2 years later with the TR-63. This was the radio that truly changed the world, primarily because it was the centerpiece of one of the greatest humbugs in the history of international trade. The TR-63 was marketed as the world's first pocketable radio. This was a brilliant stroke of rhetoric. The only problem was that the TR-63 was just a fraction of an inch too large for the standard pocket of a gentleman's dress shirt. A lesser people might have gone back to the drawing board and tried to shrink the radio, but the Japanese understood the American mind far better than we understood theirs. They didn't shrink the radio. They enlarged the pockets. Morita, in a move that would have made P.T. Barnum tip his hat in respect, had special shirts made for his salesmen. These shirts featured pockets of an unnaturally generous size, pockets that could comfortably house a TR-63 without so much as a bulge. The salesman would stand before a crowd of skeptical American retailers, casually slide the radio into their pocket with a flourish, and then pull it out again as if they had just performed a miracle of physics. "Look," the retailers cried, "it fits in a pocket. The future is here." They never checked the tailoring. They were too enchanted by the spectacle. We Americans love a spectacle nearly as much as we love a bargain, and the Sony radio offered both. It was smaller than the Regency, it was better built, and it didn't sound quite so much like a cat being strangled in a telephone booth. It still wasn't a mahogany monster. No one was going to mistake a TR-63 for a symphony hall, but it was good enough. And good enough is the most terrifying phrase in the history of commerce. Once a thing is good enough and portable, the excellent and stationary thing is doomed. The mahogany monster sat in its corner, glowing with its hot vacuum tube pride, while the TR-63 began to scuttle across the landscape like a shiny plastic beetle. The Japanese Contender had arrived, and it brought with it a new philosophy of manufacturing. They weren't just selling a radio. They were selling the idea that Japan was no longer the maker of trinkets and trash. Before the TR-63, Made in Japan was a label that usually preceded a toy breaking on Christmas morning. After the TR-63, it began to mean something else. It meant precision. It meant that the thing was going to work until the battery died, and perhaps even a little longer, just to show off. The success of the Sony radios was a cold shower for the American giants like RCA and Zenith. They had spent 40 years perfecting the art of the cabinet, and suddenly the world didn't want cabinets. The world wanted to walk. The world wanted to be somewhere else. I find a profound irony in the fact that we provided the spark, but the Japanese built the fire. We gave them the transistor, and they used it to dismantle our domestic peace. They took the noise of the world and put it into a box that could be hidden under a pillow, thereby ensuring that the next generation would never have to endure a moment of silence or a single unadorned thought. I remember watching a young lad on a street corner in San Francisco, clutching a Japanese radio to his ear. He looked as though he were receiving a direct revelation from the Almighty. "What are you listening to, son?" I inquired. "It's a new sound," he said, his eyes glazing over with a sort of rhythmic madness. "It's called rock and roll. It's coming from a station 300 miles away." "And does it sound like music?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It sounds like the world is breaking," he shouted happily. Indeed it was. The world was breaking into millions of little pieces, each one no larger than a pack of cards, each one held to a different ear, and each one manufactured by a company whose name nobody could quite pronounce a few years prior. The Japanese Contender hadn't just entered the war, it had redesigned the battlefield. The mahogany monster was now merely a very expensive place to put a lamp, while the little plastic boxes from Tokyo were busy rewriting the soundtrack of civilization. We had invented the transistor to save the world from the heat of the vacuum tube. Instead, we had merely invented a way to carry our distractions with us into the grave. It was a masterpiece of ingenuity. And as I watched that lad walk away, vibrating to the tinny beat of a distant drum, I couldn't help but think that the wise men at Bell Labs should have perhaps left that germanium in the ground where it couldn't do any harm. But that is the way of the world. One man discovers a fire, and another man immediately uses it to burn down his neighbor's fence just to see if it can be done. Chapter 5. The Tailor's Conspiracy. It is a well-documented fact, though one seldom discussed in the hallowed halls of theology or the smoky backrooms of political conventions, that the tailor is the true architect of human destiny. We are told that clothes make the man, but this is a half-truth of the most dangerous variety. The tailor does not merely make the man, he cages him. He decides where a man's hand shall rest, how far his legs may stride without a catastrophic mechanical failure of the inseam, and, most crucially, what a man may carry against his person without appearing to be smuggling a ham. For centuries, the dimensions of a gentleman's pocket were governed by the traditional requirements of civilization: a pocket watch, a handkerchief for the weeping or the dusty, a few coins for the corrupting of officials, and perhaps a small flask of medicinal brandy to ward off the vapors. These were the standard ballast of a dignified life. But when the transistor radio arrived, it brought with it a crisis of upholstery that threatened to unravel the very fabric of society. As I have previously noted, the Japanese gentlemen at Sony had produced the TR-63, a device they claimed was pocketable. This was a piece of rhetorical gymnastics that would have made a Missouri land speculator blush. The radio was, in reality, a fraction of an inch too large for the standard American shirt pocket. It was like trying to fit a gallon of truth into a pint-sized politician. The vessel simply wasn't built for the volume. Now, a lesser people, perhaps a people less acquainted with the dark arts of the humbug, would have shrunk the radio. They would have gone back to their germanium and their soldering irons and labored until the device was the size of a postage stamp. But the Japanese understood a fundamental truth about the American character. We do not want things to be smaller. We want to believe that we are larger. Thus was born the Tailor's Conspiracy. It began quietly, as all great conspiracies do, in the garment districts and the sales rooms. Akio Morita, a man who possessed a finer grasp of human vanity than most emperors, realized that if the radio would not fit the pocket must be forced to fit the radio. He did not lobby the physicists. He lobbied the seamstresses. He had special shirts commissioned for his salesmen, garments of a deceptive and miraculous construction. To the casual observer, they appeared to be ordinary white dress shirts, the kind worn by men who spend their days counting other people's money. But in truth, they were tactical equipment. The pockets had been enlarged by exactly the margin required to swallow a TR-63 without a struggle. I have seen many a miracle in my time. I have seen a man claim to talk to ghosts and another claim to turn lead into gold. But nothing matches the spectacle of a Sony salesman casually sliding a plastic box into his chest and pretending it wasn't there. It was a feat of prestidigitation that would have sent a medieval mob searching for dry kindling and a stake. The salesman would stand before a group of department store buyers, vibrating with the secret knowledge of his altered seams. "Observe," he would say, with the oily confidence of a man selling a lightly used riverboat. "The TR-63, it is small, it is light, it is pocketable. And with a flick of the wrist that would have shamed a 3-card Monte dealer, the radio would vanish into the oversized maw on his left breast. The buyers, men who generally prided themselves on their cynicism, were utterly undone. They didn't check the stitching. They didn't measure the pocket. They were so enchanted by the idea of a portable world that they failed to notice they were being sold a bill of goods by a man in a trick shirt. They rushed to their telephones to order thousands of units, convinced that every man in America was walking around with a cavernous void on his chest, just waiting to be filled with Japanese electronics. This led to the great pocket inflation of the late 50s. Suddenly, the American silhouette began to sag. If you walked down Broadway or Main Street, you would see men of otherwise sound mind and steady character tilting alarmingly to one side. The left side of their shirts would be pulled taut by the weight of 4 transistors and a 9-volt battery, creating a sort of technological scoliosis that would have baffled a physician but delighted a merchant. The tailor, once the guardian of elegance, became the enabler of noise. He was whispered to in the fitting rooms. "Make the pocket a bit deeper, Jenkins," the customer would say, glancing around to ensure his wife wasn't listening. "I've got a device I need to carry." And Jenkins, knowing which side his bread was buttered on, would oblige, thereby ensuring that the gentleman could carry a ball game into a funeral or a jazz quintet into a board meeting. I find a profound and biting irony in this. For generations, we used our pockets to carry the tools of quietude, the pipe, the book, the letter, from a distant friend. The pocket was a place of private treasures, but the tailor's conspiracy turned the pocket into a public nuisance. It allowed a man to broadcast his tastes, or more often his lack thereof, to everyone within a 20-foot radius. It took the soul of the home, the radio, and made it a parasite that clung to the ribs of the citizenry. There is a particular kind of snobbery that accompanies a new convenience, and the pocket radio crowd had it in spades. They would walk through the park, their shirts bulging with plastic, looking down their noses at the poor wretches who were still forced to go home to hear the news. They were the pioneers of the unplugged life, seemingly unaware that they were now permanently tethered to a battery maker's whim. I remember encountering a gentleman of my acquaintance, a man of some standing in the community who should have known better, standing on a street corner with a TR-63 protruding from his pocket like a rectangular tumor. He was beaming. "Look at this, Mark," he cried, patting his chest with a thump that made the radio skip a beat. "The world is in my pocket. I can hear the stock reports while I'm waiting for my carriage." "And what do the reports say?" I asked, eyeing the suspicious depth of his pocket. "I have no idea," he admitted, leaning in closer so the tinny speaker could assault my eardrums. "The static is so thick I can't tell if I'm getting rich or going bankrupt, but that's not the point. The point is that I'm hearing it here, on the street. Look at how it fits." I looked. It didn't fit. It looked like he was carrying a brick in a silk purse. But the tailor's conspiracy had done its work. He believed the lie because the pocket had been enlarged to accommodate his desire for it to be true. This was the true first salvo of the war. It wasn't just a battle of engineers. It was a battle of appearances. The Japanese had realized that to conquer America, you didn't need a better navy. You just needed to know the measurements of a size 40 regular shirt and a willingness to cheat on the seams. By the time the American manufacturers realized they had been out-tailored, it was too late. The public had tasted the forbidden fruit of portability. They had seen the salesman's magic trick and wanted to perform it themselves. They began to demand pocketable everything, pocketable cameras, pocketable lighters, pocketable philosophies. We became a nation of bulge-breasted wanderers, carrying our distractions like holy relics, all while the tailors of the world chuckled into their measuring tapes. The mahogany monster, meanwhile, sat in the parlor, its pockets, if a piece of furniture can be said to have pockets, empty and its purpose forgotten. It was too big to fit into the new world. It was a dinosaur in an age of plastic insects. The tailor's conspiracy had ensured that the future would be worn on the sleeve, or rather just above the heart, and that silence would eventually become something you could only find if you forgot to buy a fresh battery. It was a magnificent humbug, expertly executed. And as I watched my friend tilt down the street, lopsided and loud, I couldn't help but wonder if the next step in human evolution would be a natural-born pocket in the skin, provided by a providence that saw where we were headed and decided to save us the cost of the tailoring. But until then, we had the TR-63 and a very deep sense of vanity to carry us through the noise. Chapter 6. The Arrival of the Noise Box. It has been my long-held suspicion that the primary goal of the human race, once it has secured a roof over its head and a reasonably reliable source of salt pork, is to find a way to make itself intolerable to its neighbors. For centuries, we were limited in this endeavor by the natural range of the human lungs. If a man wished to annoy the entire block, he had to go out on his porch and shout, an exhausting exercise that eventually led to a sore throat and a return to blessed silence. But man, in his restless search for progress, which is usually just a fancy word for making things worse at a higher speed, could not leave well enough alone. He required a mechanical surrogate for his own vanity. He required the noise box. By the late 1950s, the pocketable radio had ceased to be a mere curiosity, or a magician's trick performed by salesmen with trick pockets. It had become a pestilence. It had descended upon the nation like a swarm of electronic locusts. And like the locusts of old, it brought with it a great deal of buzzing and a distinct lack of any useful purpose. We no longer spoke of the radio with the hushed reverence one might accord a cathedral or a very large, expensive clock. We spoke of the noise box with the weary, defeated tone one reserves for a neighbor's barking dog, or a persistent case of the gout. The arrival of the noise box signaled the final collapse of the social contract. You see, in the days of the mahogany monster, there was a certain geographical etiquette to noise. If you wanted to hear a brass band or a political harangue, you went to the parlor. The noise was contained by four walls and a sense of domestic propriety. If a passerby on the sidewalk heard your radio, it was a faint, muffled hum, like the distant grumbling of a thunderstorm that has decided to stay in the next county. But the noise box changed all that. It liberated the racket. It gave the noise legs and a set of batteries, and it sent it out into the world to do mischief. Suddenly, no place was sacred. I recall attempting to enjoy a quiet afternoon in the park, a place where, by rights, the only sounds should be the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional snoring of a vagrant. My peace was shattered by the arrival of a youth, a creature composed mostly of uncombed hair and a look of vacant intensity, who was clutching a small plastic rectangle to his ear. From this rectangle emerged a sound that defied every known law of acoustics. It was a tinny, shivering vibration that suggested a very small brass band was being tortured inside a biscuit tin. It lacked bass, it lacked treble, and it possessed a mid-range that sounded like a saw hitting a rusty nail. It was not music, it was an electronic mosquito that had learned how to hum a melody. The youth sat down on a nearby bench, oblivious to the fact that he was currently broadcasting a report on the price of hog bellies to everyone within a 50-yard radius. He looked as though he were receiving a private revelation from the Almighty, yet he was sharing that revelation with the entire world, whether the world wanted it or not. This was the true genius and the true horror of the noise box. It allowed for the individualization of public space. It was the first time a man could carry his own personal environment with him, imposing his tastes, his interests, and his tinniness upon the innocent bystander. It was the birth of the portable nuisance. The bus, once a place of somber communal silence where people stared at the backs of each other's necks and contemplated their failures, became a rolling cacophony. On any given Tuesday, a passenger might be subjected to 3 different ball games, 2 distinct sermons, and a teenage girl's devotion to a man singing about a purple people eater, all occurring simultaneously in a space no larger than a vegetable garden. It was a symphony of chaos, a Tower of Babel that you could carry in your pocket. And what did we gain for this sacrifice of our collective sanity? We gained the ability to be constantly distracted. The noise box was the first device that made it impossible for a man to be alone with his own thoughts. In the old days, if you were walking to the post office, you were forced to think. You might think about your debts, or the weather, or why your cousin Lemuel had decided to join the circus. It was a healthy, if occasionally depressing exercise, but with the noise box, thinking became optional. You could simply turn the knob and fill the vacuum of your mind with the latest weather report or a jingle for a new brand of laundry soap. The sound quality, as I have noted, was atrocious. If you have ever heard a symphony played through a telephone receiver held inside a cardboard box, you have some idea of the fidelity of these early transistors. But the public didn't care about fidelity. They cared about presence. They wanted the noise to be there, right next to their heads, vibrating their eardrums with the constant comforting assurance that they were connected to something. To what, they weren't entirely sure, but as long as the static was loud enough, it didn't seem to matter. The static, by the way, was a fundamental part of the noise box experience. These little devices had the reception of a wet noodle. Unless you were standing directly under a radio tower or holding the device at a specific 45-degree angle toward the North Star, the signal was perpetually accompanied by a sound like a frying pan full of bacon. We became a nation of amateur antennas. You would see men standing on street corners, twisting their bodies into pretzels, holding their radios aloft in a desperate attempt to hear the score of the game over the roar of the atmospheric interference. "I've got it," they would shout, their faces lighting up with a holy glow as a faint, crackling voice emerged from the plastic. "I can hear the announcer. He says it's a crackle, hiss, pop, and the crowd is possessed." It was a magnificent idiocy. We were paying $50 for the privilege of listening to the wind howl through a transistor. The manufacturers, of course, leaned into this madness. They began to produce the noise box in every conceivable shape and color. There were radios that looked like cameras, radios that looked like globes, and radios that were built into the handles of umbrellas. Because if there is one thing a man needs while walking through a torrential downpour, it is a tinny rendition of blue suede shoes. They made them out of plastic that smelled of chemicals and heat, a scent that became the official perfume of the 1950s. The older generation, my generation, watched this with a mixture of bewilderment and genuine alarm. We saw the noise box as a sign of the end times. We saw the teenagers huddling together, their heads bowed over a glowing dial, and we thought they were plotting a revolution. We didn't realize they were just waiting for the next song to start. We didn't understand that the noise box was their engine of rebellion, a way to carve out a world that their parents couldn't enter, simply because their parents couldn't stand the sound of it. The noise box was the first step toward the earphone culture, though that particular brand of isolation was still a few years off. For now, the noise was public. It was aggressive. It was the sound of a world that had decided that quiet was a symptom of death, and that loud was the only proof of life. I remember once asking a young man why he felt the need to carry his radio to the cemetery while visiting his departed aunt. "It's for the company, Mr. Twain," he said, adjusting the volume until the static nearly rattled his teeth. "It makes the place feel less, well, dead." "My boy," I replied, "if your aunt can hear that racket through 6 feet of Missouri clay, she isn't dead. She's merely waiting for the battery to run out so she can finally get some sleep." He didn't listen, of course. He couldn't. He had the noise box held to his ear, and the world, with all its wisdom, its silence, and its departed aunts, was being successfully drowned out by a man in a studio 300 miles away who was trying to sell him a bottle of hair tonic. The Mahogany monster was a memory. The age of the parlor was over. The world had become a beehive of tinny vibrations, and we were all just workers, scurrying about with our plastic boxes, trying to find a signal in a world that was increasingly full of noise and remarkably short on sense. The arrival of the noise box was not just a technical achievement, it was a psychological catastrophe, and we are vibrating from the effects of it to this very day. Chapter 7. Rock and Roll's New Engine. It is a solemn and melancholy fact that every generation of mankind is born with the innate desire to drive its predecessors into an early grave, or at the very least, into a state of permanent, involuntary twitching. In my time, a young man expressed his rebellion by smoking a corncob pipe behind the smokehouse, or perhaps by suggesting that a local deacon was not entirely above the temptation of a rigged card game. It was a localized, manageable brand of deviltry. But the mid-20th century, in its infinite capacity for mass-producing chaos, invented a brand of rebellion that required neither tobacco nor blasphemy. It required only a rhythm that sounded like a boiler explosion and a machine small enough to carry the fuse. I speak, of course, of rock and roll and its primary delivery system, the transistor radio. If the transistor was the bullet, rock and roll was the gunpowder, and the American teenager was the unfortunate soul standing behind the trigger, blissfully unaware that he was about to blow the roof off the Victorian age. Before the arrival of this new engine, music was a disciplined, orderly affair. It was something you sat down for, like a Sunday roast or a sentencing hearing. It was filtered through the gatekeepers, those somber men in suits who decided which melodies were fit for the sensitive ears of the public. If a song lacked a certain moral uplift or a melody that could be whistled by a sober person, it simply wasn't broadcast. The Mahogany monster in the parlor was a loyal servant of the status quo. It played what it was told, and it played it with a dignity that suggested it might join the church at any moment. Then came the noise box, and with it, a sound that the Mahogany monster would have choked on. Rock and roll did not arrive as a polite guest. It arrived like a riverboat captain who has just lost his life savings in a poker game and decided to take it out on the piano. It was a sound composed of equal parts electricity, glandular frustration, and a beat so heavy it could be used to drive pilings into a muddy riverbank. To the ears of a civilized man, it was a melodic catastrophe. It featured men, most notably a young fellow from Mississippi with a pompadour that defied the laws of gravity, who sang as though they were being electrocuted and enjoyed the sensation immensely. I believe his name was Elvis, though to judge by the reactions of the clergy and the school boards, his true name was Legion. He did not merely sing, he performed a series of unnatural gyrations that suggested his lower half was being operated by an entirely different and much more scandalous committee than his upper half. Now, had this music been confined to the Mahogany monster, it might have been contained. A father could simply turn the brass knob, declare the sound an affront to decency, and return the household to the soothing strains of a Lawrence Welk polka. The parent held the spigot. The parent controlled the flow of culture. But the transistor radio bypassed the parent entirely. It was the great liberator of the adolescent. For the first time in the history of the world, a child could own the means of his own distraction. He could purchase a Japanese-made plastic box, slide it into his pocket, provided his tailor had participated in the conspiracy I previously described, and carry his engine of insurrection wherever he pleased. He could take it to the garage, the soda fountain, or the local lover's lane. He was no longer a captive of the family parlor. He was a citizen of a new, vibrating republic, a nation of the transistorized. The transistor radio was the only machine capable of doing rock and roll justice, primarily because both were fundamentally tinny. There is a peculiar synergy between a 2-inch speaker and a distorted electric guitar. Neither has any business pretending to be high fidelity, and so they met on the common ground of sheer, unadulterated racket. The music sounded like a riot in a hardware store, and the radio delivered that riot with a shrill, piercing enthusiasm that could cut through a parent's lecture like a hot knife through butter. I have observed a youth of 17 huddling over his radio as though it were a campfire in a blizzard. He was listening to a station broadcasting from 1,000 miles away, a clear channel signal that bounced off the very atmosphere of the earth just to tell him that a big bopper was currently hello babying his way into history. The signal would fade, it would hiss, it would crackle with the sound of 1,000 frying pans, but the boy didn't care. He was hearing the beat. That beat was the engine. It was a rhythmic conviction that life was happening now, and that it was happening somewhere else, and that it was definitely not happening in the presence of one's parents. The transistor radio gave that feeling a physical form. It was the first time a generation could say, This is mine, and you cannot stop it, because I can take it where you cannot follow. The War of the Transistor thus became a war of geography. Parents tried to banish the radios from the dinner table, only to have them appear in the bathroom. They banned them from the bedroom, only to have them smuggled under the covers, where the youth would lie in the dark, the glowing dial of his Sony or Zenith acting as a beacon of rebellion, listening to the forbidden rhythm and blues at a volume so low it was felt rather than heard. It was a lonely crowd of millions, all listening to the same song in total isolation. This was a radical shift in the human character. We were becoming a people who lived in our own heads, or rather, in our own ears. The communal experience of the parlor was being replaced by the private experience of the pocket. We were learning the art of being alone together. You could see a dozen teenagers standing on a street corner, each with a radio held to his ear, each vibrating to a different frequency, yet all united by the common goal of ignoring the world around them. The manufacturers, sensing a profit of biblical proportions, began to design the radios to appeal to this new teens market. They abandoned the jade green and cloud gray of the adult world and embraced colors that looked like a melted box of crayons: hot pink, electric blue, and screaming yellow. They made the radios look like sports cars, like rockets, like anything that suggested speed and a total lack of responsibility. The 9-volt battery became the new currency of youth. A teenager might not have enough money for a decent meal, but he would find the 60 cents required to buy a fresh ever-ready battery to keep his engine running for another week. To be dead, that is, to have a radio with a flat battery, was a social tragedy of the highest order. It was to be cut off from the hum of the universe. The older generation looked on with a mixture of horror and bewilderment. They wrote letters to the editor claiming that the tinny vibration of the transistor was causing a softening of the American brain. They argued that rock and roll was a communist plot designed to ruin our posture and our morals. They were half right, of course. Our posture was certainly suffering from the constant tilting of the head toward the speaker, but they failed to see that the revolution was already over. The Mahogany monster was a dinosaur, and the noise box was the small furry mammal that was eating its eggs. The new engine had started, and it was fueled by a combination of germanium and teenage angst. It was loud, it was cheap, and it was portable. And as any riverboat pilot can tell you, once you start the engines and head downstream with the current of history at your back, there is no power on earth, not even a father's glare or a preacher's sermon, that can turn the boat around. The age of the parlor was dead. The age of the pocket insurrection had begun, and the soundtrack, played through a speaker the size of a silver dollar, was a glorious, static-filled scream of a wop-pop-a-loo-mop-a-lop-bam-boom. It made no sense whatsoever, which was precisely why it was the most important thing in the world. Chapter 8. The End of the Family Parlor. I have often thought that the American parlor was one of the most successful instruments of domestic torture ever devised by a species that prides itself on having abolished the rack and the thumbscrew. In the years of my residence upon this sphere, the parlor was not a room for living, it was a room for appearing. It was a curated museum of lace doilies, velvet curtains that smelled of ancient dust and forgotten prayers, and furniture so stiff and uncompromising that it seemed to have been designed by a man who harbored a deep personal grudge against the human spine. It was a place where a child went to be told he was fidgeting, and where an adult went to pretend he enjoyed the company of its in-laws. At the center of this shrine to propriety sat the mahogany monster, the console radio. It was the mechanical glue that held the family unit together, much in the same way that a pair of iron shackles holds a chain gang together. It forced a communal existence. If there was to be music or news or a dramatic recitation of a detective's exploits, it had to be shared. There was no such thing as a private opinion in the parlor. If the radio said the weather was fine, the entire family agreed it was fine, or at least they all suffered the same crackling report simultaneously. The father was the high priest of this mahogany altar. He alone possessed the divine right of the dial. He sat in his armchair, the only piece of furniture in the room that didn't feel like it was made of petrified wood, and governed the household's cultural intake with the heavy-handedness of a Balkan dictator. If he wanted to hear a lecture on the virtues of the gold standard, the children sat in a state of suspended animation, contemplating the patterns in the carpet until they reached a level of boredom that bordered on the transcendental. The parlor radio was the last stand of the family circle. It was a geography of enforced togetherness. You knew what your brother was thinking because he was making a face at the same song you were hearing. You knew your mother was moved by a soap opera because you could hear her sniffing over the sound of the vacuum tubes warming up. It was a shared life, dictated by the fact that the noise was too heavy to move and too expensive to duplicate. Then came the transistor, and with it, the parlor died a death so sudden and so complete that it makes the disappearance of the great auk look like a lingering departure. The transistor radio was not just a technical marvel, it was a domestic wrecking ball. It was the first device to suggest to a human being that he did not, in fact, have to sit in the same room as his father in order to be entertained. It was an electronic emancipation proclamation for every teenager who had ever been forced to listen to a fireside chat, when he would rather have been listening to a man in tight trousers howling about his blue suede shoes. The exodus began quietly. It started with the bedroom hermit. In the old days, a boy went to his room to sleep, to study, or to be punished. Now, he went to his room to live. He would retreat with his plastic noise box, a device no larger than a prayer book, but far more influential. And he would create a private universe behind a closed door. He was no longer a subject of the parlor's mahogany tyranny. He was the king of his own four walls, and his prime minister was a disc jockey located in a studio 3 towns over. I have observed a father standing in the middle of his empty parlor, his hand hovering over the brass knob of his 300-pound console, looking for all the world like a sea captain whose crew has just vanished into thin air. He has the news, he has the weather, he has a symphony performed by 48 Germans in tuxedos, but he has no audience. His daughter is in the kitchen with a Japanese TR-63, his son is in the garage with a Zenith, and his wife has taken a portable unit into the garden to listen to a dramatic serial while she pulls weeds. The family circle had been shattered into a dozen individual bubbles. The parlor, once the heart of the home, became a ghost town, a ceremonial space used only for weddings, funerals, and the occasional visit from a particularly terrifying clergyman. The furniture remained stiff, The doilies remained dusty, but the soul of the room, the shared attention of the tribe, had been carried off in a series of small, colorful, plastic boxes. This was the birth of a new and peculiar kind of loneliness. We became a nation of people who were together, but entirely elsewhere. You could see a family gathered for dinner, yet each member was vibrating to a different frequency. The son was thinking of a baseball score he'd heard on the porch. The daughter was humming a forbidden melody she'd caught in the bathroom. The father was brooding over a political commentary he'd heard in the privacy of his study. They were occupying the same physical space, but their minds were scattered across the dial like chaff in a windstorm. The social contract of the home was rewritten. In the age of the monster, you learned the art of compromise. You learned to tolerate the shadow because your sister tolerated the Lone Ranger. You learned that your tastes were not the only tastes in the world. But the transistor taught us the opposite. It taught us that we could have exactly what we wanted, exactly when we wanted it, without the burdensome necessity of considering anyone else's opinion. It was the sovereignty of the self, powered by a 9-volt battery. I find a profound irony in the fact that we called this progress. We celebrated the portability of the radio as if it were a great victory for human freedom, never realizing that we were merely building smaller and more efficient cages for ourselves. We traded the tyrannically shared experience for the perfectly isolated one. We decided that being able to hear a weather report while sitting on the privy was worth the cost of never again having a conversation with our children that wasn't interrupted by a tinny vibration from their shirt pockets. The parlor was a terrible room, to be sure. It was cold, it was formal, and it was a masterpiece of Victorian repression. But it was a place where we knew each other. We knew the exact moment our father would lose his temper with the static, and we knew the exact moment our mother would start to hum along with the choir. We were a collective, bound by the limitations of our technology. The transistor radio made us modern. It made us mobile. It made us connected to the entire world, yet strangely disconnected from the person sitting 3 feet away. We became a race of wanderers, each carrying a private oracle in our hand, listening to voices from across the continent, while the silence in our own homes grew louder and more profound. I remember seeing an old man sitting on his porch, his hand resting on a small plastic radio. He looked contented enough, but there was a certain vacancy in his eyes. "Is that a good machine you have there?" I asked. "The best," he said. "I can hear everything. I can hear London. I can hear New York. I can hear the ball game in St. Louis." "And what can you hear from inside the house?" I inquired. He paused, the static from his radio hissing like a disgruntled serpent. "Inside," he said with a puzzled frown. "Inside, it's quiet. Everyone's got their own, you see. My wife's in the parlor with hers, and the boy's in the cellar with his. We don't have to argue about the stations anymore." "A magnificent achievement," I remarked, turning to go. "You've traded your arguments for an electronic peace. I only hope that when the batteries finally fail, you'll still remember how to talk to one another without the assistance of a germanium crystal." He didn't answer. He couldn't. A man 300 miles away had just started telling him about a new kind of breakfast cereal, and the old man was listening with the rapt attention of a scholar discovering a lost gospel. The parlor was dead. The mahogany monster was a relic, and the American family had finally achieved its ultimate goal. They were all in the same house, yet they hadn't spoken a word to each other in 3 days. It was a triumph of engineering, a masterpiece of convenience, and a total catastrophe of the human spirit, which is to say, it was a typical human success. As the sun set on the era of the parlor, the lights stayed on in the bedrooms, where the tiny glowing dials of 1,000,000 transistors acted as the new hearth fires of a fragmented nation. We were no longer a family, we were a network. And the signal, though portable and loud, was remarkably thin. Chapter 9. The Battery Makers Become Royalty. It has been my observation that freedom is the most expensive commodity ever marketed to a species that hasn't the slightest idea what to do with it once they've bought it. Man spent 10,000 years trying to find a way to stay in one place without starving to death, and no sooner had he perfected the art of the armchair and the parlor rug than he decided his greatest tragedy was being tethered. He looked at the electrical cord of his mahogany monster, that sturdy, reliable umbilical cord connecting him to the infinite teats of the local power plant, and he saw not a convenience, but a chain. He yearned for the mobile life. He wanted to be a wanderer, a nomad, a citizen of the open road, provided the road had a decent snack bar and a place to buy a fresh collar. And so he embraced the transistor radio. He celebrated his liberation from the wall plug with the same fervor a prisoner might celebrate the burning of his jail, forgetting that a man who is no longer in jail is now entirely responsible for his own groceries. In the world of electronics, groceries are spelled B-A-T-T-E-R-I-E-S. The arrival of the portable radio created almost overnight a new and terrifying class of global nobility, the battery makers. These were men who had previously spent their lives in the dusty, unglamorous business of selling zinc and carbon to people whose flashlights had failed during a basement flood. They were the wallflowers of industry, ignored and unloved. But with the advent of the transistor, these humble purveyors of portable lightning were suddenly elevated to the rank of merchant princes. They didn't just sell power. They sold the temporary absence of silence, and they charged for it with a cynicism that would make a riverboat gambler weep with envy. The battery is a masterpiece of capitalist theater. It is a small sealed container of hope that begins to die the very instant you remove it from the store shelf. Unlike the electricity from the wall, which is a robust, immortal flow of energy that only stops when a tree falls on a wire or a politician forgets to pay the city's coal bill, the battery is a frail, ephemeral thing. It possesses the life expectancy of a mayfly and the reliability of a campaign promise. Specifically, I wish to speak of that curious, rectangular little brick known as the 9-volt battery. If the transistor radio was the engine of insurrection, the 9-volt battery was the ransom note. It was a tiny plastic-wrapped box of chemicals that cost roughly the same as a respectable lunch, yet possessed only enough energy to power a teenager's musical rebellion for approximately 3.5 hours. It featured 2 metallic snaps on the top, one male, one female, which always reminded me of a particularly cold and unfeeling marriage. To install a 9-volt battery was to perform a feat of surgical precision. You had to align those snaps with their counterparts inside the radio, an operation usually performed in the dark, in the back of a moving automobile, or while hiding under the bed covers. If you got it right, the radio would reward you with a faint, hopeful crackle. If you got it wrong, nothing happened, and you were left staring at a piece of plastic that was now 60 cents worth of useless ballast. The battery makers, the men of Eveready, Duracell, and Rayovasca, became the true rulers of the 1950s. They understood a fundamental truth about the human animal. Once a man has tasted the ability to hear a baseball game while standing in the middle of a trout stream, he will pay any price to keep that miracle alive. He becomes an addict. He becomes a battery chaser. I have seen a man of otherwise sound mind and steady character standing at a drugstore counter at midnight, his eyes wild and his hair disheveled, clutching a dead radio to his chest like a wounded bird. "I need a 9-volt," he would gasp, slamming his change onto the counter. "The game is in the 11th inning. I've lost the signal. For the love of all that is holy, give me the juice." The clerk, a man who had seen this brand of desperation many times before, would calmly reach behind him and produce the requested brick. He didn't even have to wrap it. The man would rip open the packaging with his teeth, snap the battery into place, and vanish into the night. His head bowed over the tiny speaker as the tinny voice of the announcer returned from the dead. The battery makers were the only people in the world who benefited from a long, drawn-out ball game or a particularly catchy song. Every time a disc jockey played a long version of a popular hit, a battery maker in a penthouse in New York would pour himself another glass of champagne. They were selling a commodity that was designed by its very nature to be exhaustible. This was the birth of planned obsolescence in its purest form. A vacuum tube might last 5 years, but a battery was a guest that stayed for dinner and left before the dishes were washed. We became a nation of people perpetually running out. We lived in a state of battery anxiety, a new psychological disorder characterized by the constant checking of the radio's volume. You see, as a battery dies, it doesn't just stop. It fades. It undergoes a slow, agonizing decline that mirrors the aging process of the human soul. First, the high notes vanish. Then, the volume begins to drop, forcing you to hold the radio closer and closer to your ear until you are practically wearing it as jewelry. Finally, the voice of the announcer becomes a distorted, subterranean growl, as if he is broadcasting from the bottom of a very deep and very muddy well. In our desperation to avoid another trip to the store, we invented the lick test. This was a primitive and frankly disgusting form of scientific inquiry used by boys across the nation to determine if a battery still contained a spark of life. You would touch your tongue to the 2 metallic snaps on the top of the 9-volt brick. If you felt a sharp metallic sting that made your eyes water and your hair stand on end, the battery was good. If you felt nothing but the cold, indifferent taste of zinc, it was dead. It is a testament to the power of the transistor that an entire generation of American youth spent their Saturdays licking industrial chemicals just to see if they could hear another 10 minutes of Chuck Berry. I have seen many forms of religious devotion in my travels, pilgrims climbing mountains on their knees, ascetics living on pillars, but nothing quite matches the sight of a 12-year-old boy tasting a battery in a desperate attempt to commune with the spirit of rock and roll. The wealth accumulated by the battery makers was staggering. They didn't have to build mahogany cabinets. They didn't have to hire engineers to design complex circuits. They just had to keep the world's portable noise running. They were the oil barons of the airwaves, the silent partners in every teenage rebellion. They also understood the power of the multi-pack. They knew that a man would never buy just one battery if he could be convinced that he might need 4. They sold them in blister packs that were impossible to open without a chainsaw, ensuring that by the time you actually got the battery out, you were in such a state of rage that you needed the radio just to calm your nerves. I find a profound irony in our liberation from the wall plug. We thought we were becoming free, but we were merely changing masters. We traded the stationary tyranny of the electric company for the portable extortion of the battery maker. We were now mobile, which is a fancy way of saying we were now constantly searching for a store that was open on a Sunday. The Mahogany monster, for all its faults, was a cheap date. You bought the electricity by the month, and it was so inexpensive you didn't even notice the cost. But the transistor radio was a high-maintenance mistress. It demanded a constant tribute of zinc and carbon. It required a budget. It made the act of listening to the news a financial decision. Should I hear the weather report? A man might ask himself, eyeing his last battery. Or should I save the juice for the Friday night fights? This was the true revolution of the transistor. It made us aware of the cost of noise. It turned the airwaves into a metered commodity. And as I watched a young lad on a street corner frantically licking a battery as if it were a lollipop, I couldn't help but think that the battery makers had achieved the ultimate dream of every monarch in history. They had found a way to tax the very air we breathe and the sounds we hear, and they had convinced us to thank them for the privilege. The kings of old wore crowns of gold. The new royalty wore Ever Eddie on their sleeves and carried the world's silence in their pockets, ready to sell it back to us 1 hour at a time for the price of a silver dollar. The transistor war was being won not by the men who made the music or the men who made the radios, but by the men who held the keys to the portable lightning. And business, as they say, was booming, especially when the signal was weak and the batteries were dying. Next time you hear a tinny song on a street corner, remember, somewhere a battery maker is smiling, and he's already counting the change in your pocket. Chapter 10. Static, the soundtrack of a generation. It has been my observation that nature, while she is a woman of many fine qualities and a general disposition toward the picturesque, possesses a most irritating habit of refusing to leave well enough alone. Scientists tell us that nature abhors a vacuum, which is a fancy way of saying she can't stand to see a hole without trying to fill it with something useless. In the old days, when a man walked out into the woods or sat upon his porch at midnight, he was greeted by the most exquisite and rare commodity known to the human soul: silence. Silence was a profound thing. It was a canvas upon which a man could paint his own thoughts, or more often, a void in which he could comfortably realize he didn't have any thoughts worth mentioning. But when the transistor radio arrived, it didn't just bring music and news, it brought the hiss. It brought a mechanical surrogate for silence that sounded for all the world like a very small, very angry steam engine leaking somewhere in the vicinity of your left ear. We called it static. To the engineers at Bell Labs or the marketing geniuses at Sony, static was a problem to be solved, a technical glitch, a flaw in the fabric of their electronic miracle. But to the generation that grew up with a plastic box glued to their heads, Static was something much more significant. It was the background radiation of their lives. It was the soundtrack of an era that had decided that a clear, quiet night was a symptom of being out of touch. In the era of the Mahogany Monster, static was a majestic affair. It was deep, rumbling, and had the atmospheric weight of a distant thunderstorm. When the vacuum tubes were warming up, the static felt like a presence, a brooding, mahogany-scented ghost of a sound. But the transistor turned static into a shrill, piercing, and remarkably democratic nuisance. It was a high-frequency fry pan of a noise that suggested the entire universe was currently being sautéed in a large quantity of butter. There was no such thing as a clear signal in the 1950s. The airwaves were a battlefield, a swirling, invisible soup of interference, cosmic rays, and the neighbor's electric shaver. If you wanted to hear the latest report from the New York Stock Exchange or a song by a man who seemed to be having a rhythmic seizure, you had to hunt for it. You had to navigate the no man's land of the dial. I have watched a man engage in this hunt for the signal with a level of intensity usually reserved for a prospector looking for a vein of gold in a mountainside. He would grasp the tuning knob, a tiny plastic disc that required the delicate touch of a safecracker, and he would begin to rotate it by fractions of a millimeter. Hiss, pop, crackle, whir. Between the stations lay a vast, howling wilderness. It was a place where voices from 3 different states competed for dominance, accompanied by a sound like a wet sheet being torn in half. You might catch a fragment of a sermon from Tennessee, followed immediately by a laundry soap jingle from Ohio, all submerged in a roar of atmospheric static that sounded like the very wind of creation. "I think I've got it," the man would whisper, his face contorted with the effort of not breathing. "I can hear the announcer. He's talking about a psst, snap, hiss, and the crowd is pop." This was the transistor crouch. It was a new physical posture adopted by the American public, characterized by a bent spine, a tilted head, and an expression of profound, agonizing concentration. We became a nation of amateur antennas. We discovered that the human body, composed as it is of salt water and various other conductive liquids, is in fact a very fine, if somewhat temperamental, receiver. If the signal was weak, you didn't just sit there. You became part of the circuit. You would stand on one leg, lean toward the window, and extend your left arm toward the North Star. If that didn't work, you might touch the radio to a radiator, or a bed spring, or the metal frame of your spectacles. I once saw a lad in a park who had discovered that if he held his radio against a cast-iron fence and stood on his tiptoes, he could hear the baseball game in St. Louis with a clarity that bordered on the supernatural. The moment he let go, the announcer vanished back into the soup of the great hiss, leaving the boy standing there in the silence of the trees, looking as though he had just lost his only friend. We lived in a world of fading. A signal was never a permanent thing. It was a guest that was always checking its watch and looking for the exit. You would be in the middle of a gripping mystery, the detective just about to name the killer, when the signal would suddenly decide to migrate to Canada. The voice would grow thin, the static would rise like a tide, and you would be left with nothing but the sound of the invisible world laughing at your curiosity. And yet, we grew to love the static, or at least, we grew to need it. Static was the proof of life. In the age of the transistor, silence didn't mean peace. It meant the batteries were dead. Silence was the enemy. As long as there was a hiss, as long as there was a crackle, as long as there was a tiny, tinny vibration coming from the pocket, we felt connected. We were a generation that couldn't stand the sound of its own breathing. We needed the white noise to fill the empty spaces in our souls. I find it a magnificent irony that we spent millions of dollars on high-fidelity equipment for our homes, those massive, expensive speakers that could reproduce the sound of a triangle player sneezing in the back of an orchestra, while simultaneously carrying around a 3-inch plastic box that sounded like a hornet in a trash can. We traded quality for ubiquity. We decided that it was better to hear a distorted, static-filled version of the truth anywhere than to hear the clear, unadorned truth in one place. The static of the 1950s was the true soundtrack of progress. It was the sound of a world that was shrinking too fast for its own good. It was the sound of millions of people all trying to talk at once, their voices colliding in the upper atmosphere and falling back to earth in a tangled mess of electronic debris. The DJ became the new alchemist, a man who claimed to be able to pull gold out of the leaden roar of the interference. He would shout over the static, his voice a frantic rhythmic staccato, trying to outrun the hiss of the universe. "Coming to you live!" he would scream, while the radio emitted a sound like a freight train passing through a hailstorm. Through the static and the storms, we've got the hits. And we believed him. We sat in our cars, our bedrooms, and our parks, clutching our little plastic idols, nodding our heads to a beat we could only half hear, convinced that we were at the very center of the universe. We didn't realize that the static wasn't just interference, it was the voice of the world we were building, a world of constant low-level agitation, of perpetual distraction, and of a total, terrifying inability to sit still and listen to the silence. I remember an old gentleman, a man who still remembered the days of the telegraph and the horse-drawn carriage, watching a teenager struggle with a transistor radio on a train. The boy was twisting the dial back and forth, his face a mask of frustration as the static roared and hissed. "What are you looking for, son?" the old man asked. "The station," the boy snapped. "I can't find the music. It's all just noise." The old man smiled, a slow, weary smile that had seen many such progressions. "Maybe the noise is the music, boy," he said. "Maybe that's all there is left to hear." The boy didn't understand, of course. He just kept twisting the dial, looking for a voice in the storm, unaware that he was already living in the age of static, where the signal is always secondary to the racket. The mahogany monster was dead, and with it, the dignity of the silence. We had replaced the parlor with the pocket, and the fireplace with a 9-volt battery. We were mobile, we were connected, and we were perpetually annoyed by a sound that we ourselves had invited into our homes. It was a masterpiece of human ingenuity. We had finally found a way to be bored and distracted at the very same time, and we paid $50 for the privilege of the headache. The soundtrack of a generation was playing, and it sounded exactly like a swarm of electronic bees having a nervous breakdown. And the most frightening part of all, we couldn't imagine living without the sting. Chapter 11. The Dinner Table Revolution. It has been my observation, gathered over many years of watching the human animal struggle against its own best interests, that the dinner table is the final redoubt of civilization. In the grand tapestry of human history, the table was not merely a place to consume calories. It was a court of law, a theater of manners, and a primary site of domestic indoctrination. It was the only place where a father could look his offspring in the eye and ensure that they were swallowing both their turnip greens and his political opinions with the same degree of unconvincing enthusiasm. For centuries, the ritual of the family meal was governed by a set of rules more rigid than the laws of the Medes and the Persians. One sat upright. One kept one's elbows off the mahogany. One waited for the blessing to be concluded before launching an assault on the roast beef. Above all, one engaged in that most grueling and archaic of exercises, the table conversation. In the era of the mahogany monster, the radio remained in the parlor where it belonged. It was too massive to be invited to dinner. It could not sit in a chair. It could not pass the salt. Therefore, during the dinner hour, the world was effectively shut out. The only voices heard were those of the family, a circumstance that frequently led to a profound appreciation for the virtues of silence, or at least a desperate longing for the children to finish their pudding and go to bed. Then came the transistor, and with it, the dinner table revolution. This was not a revolution fought with bayonets or barricades. It was a revolution of stealth, fought with 9-volt batteries and plastic boxes hidden beneath linen napkins. It was the first time in history that a man, or more dangerously, a boy, could be physically present at the family board while being mentally, spiritually, and electronically 300 miles away at a ballpark in Chicago. I have seen the early stages of this insurrection. It began with the score checker. This was usually a father who, despite his own sermons on the sanctity of the family meal, could not bear the thought of a World Series game proceeding without his constant supervision. He would sneak his Regency TR1 into the pocket of his smoking jacket. During the blessing, while every other head was bowed in prayer, he would perform a surreptitious lick test on a spare battery, and then, with a flick of his thumb, summon the ghost of a baseball announcer into his lap. Crackle, hiss, and the pitch is... The sound would emerge from his waistband like the muffled grumbling of a ventriloquist's dummy. His wife would look up, a spoonful of peas suspended in mid-air, her eyes narrowed with the suspicion of a woman who knows her husband is up to no good but cannot quite prove the physics of the crime. "George," she would say in a tone that could freeze a boiling kettle, "is there a hornet in your trousers?" "No, my dear," he would reply, his face a mask of saintly innocence. "Just a bit of indigestion. The roast is a trifle lively tonight." But the children were not fooled. They were the true geniuses of the Revolution. They saw their father's electronic adultery and immediately sought to improve upon it. Within 6 months of the transistor's arrival, the American dinner table had become a hotbed of clandestine activity. The transistor crouch, which I have previously described as a posture of profound concentration, was adapted for the dining room. A youth would sit with his head bowed over his plate, appearing to be deeply contemplative of his mashed potatoes. In reality, he had a Sony TR-63 nestled in his lap, the volume turned just high enough to vibrate his thigh, providing him with a rhythmic update on the latest rhythmic atrocities of the hit parade. The dinner table was no longer a place of shared experience. It was a collection of individual fueling stations. The social contract of the meal, the agreement that we would all pretend to be interested in Uncle Lemuel's gallstone surgery, was torn to shreds. The transistor offered an escape hatch. It allowed the individual to secede from the family union without ever leaving his chair. It was the birth of the private life in the middle of a public setting. I find a biting irony in the fact that we called this the age of communication. We were building more ways to talk to people in distant cities while simultaneously losing the ability to talk to the person passing us the gravy. The dinner table, once the forge of character and the classroom of the tribe, was becoming a silent, clinking space where the only thing being shared was the salt and a mutual sense of resentment. The father, seeing his authority slipping away, would occasionally attempt a counter-revolution. He would declare the dining room a radio-free zone. He would confiscate any device that hummed, beeped, or hissed. He would demand a return to the old ways. "We shall have conversation," he would bellow, pounding the table until the silver rattled. "Tell me, son, what did you learn at school today?" The son, his mind still vibrating with the memory of a tinny guitar solo he caught in the hallway, would look at his father as if the man were speaking a dead dialect of Aramaic. "I don't know," he would mumble. "Stuff." The silence that followed was not the high silence of the Victorian parlor. It was a hollow, battery-depleted silence. The family had nothing to say to each other because they were all waiting for the meal to end so they could return to their private boxes. The transistor had made the world too interesting to ignore, and in doing so, it had made the family too boring to endure. We traded the communal boredom of the old world for the individual excitement of the new, never realizing that boredom is often the soil in which affection grows. You cannot love a person you are not forced to listen to. The Mahogany monster, by its very size and stationary nature, forced us to be a people. The transistor, by its portability and its price, allowed us to be a series of disconnected atoms. The dinner table revolution was the first sign that the American home was no longer a castle. It was merely a place where people parked their bodies while their minds were elsewhere. We became a nation of lap listeners, peering into our own pockets for a signal while the roast beef grew cold and the conversation grew colder. I remember seeing a cartoon in a magazine of the period, a family of 4 sitting at a table, each with a radio held to their ear, and the dog in the corner with a radio of his own. The caption read, "The Modern Family at Prayer." It was meant to be a joke, but as any satirist can tell you, a joke is merely a truth that has been dressed up in a funny hat to avoid being lynched. The revolution was complete. The sacred table had been conquered by the noise box. And as I watched a young man at a restaurant recently, staring into a small glowing slab of glass, while ignoring the young lady sitting across from him, I realized that we are still living in the wreckage of that 1954 uprising. We have swapped the transistor for the smartphone and the 9-volt battery for the lithium-ion, but the crime remains the same. We have found a way to be together without ever having to meet. The Mahogany monster is a memory, the parlor is a myth, and the dinner table is now just a convenient place to put your device while you wait for the microwave to ding. Progress, it seems, is a journey from the heart of the home to the palm of the hand, and the toll for the trip is the death of everything we used to call family. Chapter 12. The Germanium Rush of 1959. It has been my observation that the human race is never quite so pathetic as when it is in the grip of a rush. Whether it be for gold in the Sierras, land in the Oklahoma Territory, or a slightly more efficient way to peel a potato, the spectacle is always the same. A sudden, collective loss of reason, followed by a frantic stampede toward a promise that is usually 90% humbug and 10% genuine misfortune. In the year of our Lord 1849, a man needed a mule, a pan, and a sturdy pair of boots to lose his shirt in the pursuit of wealth. But by the year 1959, the prospector had undergone a most curious transformation. He no longer wore a flannel shirt or smelled of unwashed pack animal. He wore a white lab coat, smelled of industrial solvents, and carried a slide rule with the practiced air of a man who believed that the secrets of the universe could be solved by sliding a piece of wood back and forth. The gold of this new era was a substance known as germanium. Now, I have lived long enough to see many substances elevated to the rank of deity, but germanium is perhaps the most unlikely candidate for worship I have ever encountered. It is a brittle, grayish-white metalloid that looks for all the world like a piece of coal that has lost its ambition. It sounds like a hybrid between a hothouse flower and a particularly stubborn case of the measles. In reality, it was a byproduct of the zinc industry, literally the sweepings of the metallurgical floor. Yet, by 1959, this industrial dust had become more precious than the rubies of a Maharaja. Why? Because the transistor, that tiny assassin of silence I have previously described, required it. The world had decided that its primary mission in life was to shrink the radio, and germanium was the magic dirt that made it possible. This was the germanium rush, and it possessed all the fevered idiocy of the Klondike, only with more air conditioning. Suddenly, every corporation in America, from the titans like RCA and General Electric to firms that had previously specialized in making toaster components or specialized hinges, decided they were in the semiconductor business. It was a magnificent contagion. If a company didn't have a solid-state division, it was viewed by the stock market as a collection of prehistoric relics waiting for the tar pit. Investors who couldn't tell an electron from an eggplant were throwing their life savings at any enterprise that promised to turn a pile of Missouri zinc waste into a pocket-sized orchestra. The problem, as is always the case with nature's more temperamental gifts, was that germanium is a substance of extreme vanity and delicate health. It does not wish to be a transistor. It wishes to remain in a state of high-purity isolation, undisturbed by the grubby hands of man. To make a transistor in 1959 was not a matter of simple manufacturing. It was a matter of alchemy. I have visited these clean rooms, the cathedrals of the germanium rush. They are places of terrifying sterility, inhabited by men and women dressed in gowns and masks, looking as though they are preparing to perform surgery on a ghost. They handle the germanium with tweezers, bathing it in acids that would dissolve a bronze statue, and cooking it in furnaces that mimic the temperature of the sun's surface. "Is it pure?" the chief alchemist would ask, his voice muffled by his mask. "It is 99.99999% pure, sir," the assistant would reply, trembling with the weight of the decimals. Not good enough, the chief would bellow. One stray atom of copper and the whole batch will sound like a bag of wet cats. Refine it again. This was the yield game. In the early days of the rush, for every 100 transistors a company attempted to bake, they were lucky if 5 of them possessed enough character to actually amplify a signal. The rest were duds, expensive gray pebbles that were fit for nothing but filling a very high-tech gravel driveway. But such was the hunger of the public for the noise box that companies didn't care. They simply raised the price of the 5 that worked to cover the cost of the 95 that failed, and the American consumer, bless his gullible heart, paid the bill with a smile. The wise men of the industry became the new oracles. They spoke a dialect of English that was entirely incomprehensible to a person of sound mind. They talked of PN junctions, carrier injection, and donor impurities. To a Missouri River pilot, a donor impurity sounds like a man who brings his own loaded dice to a poker game, but to a semiconductor engineer, it was the very breath of life. They were engaged in a war of mills and microns, shrinking the world one fraction of an inch at a time. I find a profound irony in the geography of this rush. While the 1849ers headed west to the mountains, the 1959ers headed to the laboratory. We were no longer conquering the landscape. We were conquering the lattice. We were trying to find more room in the small than we had ever found in the large. By 1959, the germanium rush had reached a state of pure hysteria. The Japanese, as I have noted, were winning the battle of the pocket, but the Americans were determined to win the battle of the element. We built massive factories to refine this gray dust. We convinced ourselves that germanium was the permanent foundation of the electronic age. We believed we had reached the pinnacle of progress. Then, as is the habit of progress, it pulled the rug out from under us. Just as the germanium mines were at full capacity, and just as the solid-state signs were being polished on every storefront from Maine to California, a new candidate appeared on the horizon: silicon. Silicon is essentially sand. It is the most common substance on the face of the earth, right after human stupidity and unpaid bills. It is cheaper than germanium, it is sturdier, and it doesn't melt when you look at it too hard. The germanium kings looked at this upstart sand and laughed, much in the same way the Mahogany monster had laughed at the TR-1. "Sand?" they cried. "You cannot build a civilization on sand. It is difficult to refine. It is temperamental. Long live the germanium." But the sand didn't care. It was patient. Within a few short years, the germanium rush would be over, leaving behind a trail of obsolete factories and millions of tiny gray transistors that would eventually find their way into the back of a junk drawer. The great semiconductor war of 1959 was merely a skirmish before the total victory of the beachfront property. I remember watching a modern man in 1959 standing in front of a department store window, clutching a germanium radio to his chest as if it were a holy relic. "It's the future, Mr. Twain," he said, his eyes wide with the fever of the era. "They say that one day these transistors will be so small you won't even be able to see them." "And what will we do with them then, my boy?" I asked. "We'll put them in everything," he shouted. We'll put them in our watches. We'll put them in our cars. We'll put them in our very brains if we have to." "A terrifying prospect," I remarked, "to have the noise box inside your own skull with no way to turn the knob or remove the battery. I suppose at that point a man will finally be able to achieve the ultimate goal of the modern age, to never have to listen to a single one of his own thoughts ever again." He didn't hear me. He was too busy listening to a tinny weather report from a station 200 miles away, transmitted through a sliver of refined zinc trash. The Germanium rush was a magnificent, expensive, and perfectly useless episode in the history of human restlessness. It proved that we will go to any length and pay any price to make the world smaller, louder, and more complicated. And as I watched the wise men scramble to adjust their slide rules for the coming age of silicon, I couldn't help but think that the only thing more common than sand on this planet is the man who is willing to buy it for the price of gold, provided you tell him it's electronic. The rush was ending. The era of the crystal was giving way to the era of the chip, and the noise, as always, was only getting started. Chapter 13. Zenith and the Heavy Boat Anchors. There is a deep-seated, nearly theological conviction in the American soul that if an object does not possess enough physical weight to serve as a murder weapon in a pinch, it cannot possibly be of any value. We are a people who equate heft with honesty. If you buy a gold watch and it feels like a feather, you feel cheated. But if it weighs down your arm until your shoulder develops a permanent list to the port side, you feel you have received the very pinnacle of Swiss craftsmanship. In the late 1950s, while the Japanese were busy perfecting the art of the insubstantial trifle, those little plastic radios that weighed about as much as a well-composed lie, the Americans at the Zenith Radio Corporation in Chicago were holding the line for dignity, gravity, and the sheer unadulterated glory of the boat anchor. Now, boat anchor is a term of endearment used by radio collectors of a certain vintage to describe a device that requires a team of mules and a structural engineer to move from one room to another. Zenith was the high priest of this heavy religion. They viewed the tiny Japanese transistors with the same weary contempt a master stonemason might reserve for a man building a house out of gingerbread. To the gentleman at Zenith, a radio was not a toy. It was an investment in timber, chrome, and tempered steel. It was intended to survive a hurricane, a house fire, or a direct hit from a medium-sized cannon. The crown jewel of this philosophy was the Zenith Transoceanic. If the Mahogany monster was the cathedral of the Parlor, the Transoceanic was the armored cruiser of the portable world. I use the word portable in the same sense that a Victorian steamer trunk is portable, which is to say, it is perfectly mobile, provided you have a sturdy handle, a strong back, and a servant named James, who doesn't mind a bit of heavy lifting. The Transoceanic was a magnificent beast. It was wrapped in something called black stag leather, a substance so tough it suggested the stag in question had been raised on a diet of iron filings and bitterness. It featured a front cover that flipped down to reveal a world of dials, switches, and a map of the globe that implied the owner was a man of such international intrigue that he might, at any moment, need to know the exact time in Madagascar or the weather conditions in the Belgian Congo. It was designed for the adventurer. The advertisements always showed a man of rugged features, usually wearing a safari jacket, and a look of grim determination. Crouched in a tent in the middle of a desert listening to the BBC while a lion prowled outside. The message was clear. If you were going to be eaten by a wild animal, you should at least be well informed about the cricket scores in London. The problem, of course, was that 99% of transoceanics never saw anything more adventurous than a suburban back porch in Peoria. But that didn't matter. The American man bought the Zenith because he wanted to feel like the kind of man who might, if the whim took him, fly a twin-engine plane over the Andes. He wanted a radio that felt like a piece of military hardware, and by heaven did it weigh like one. A transoceanic of the vacuum tube era weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 25 pounds. This did not include the batteries. And let us speak of those batteries. A Zenith did not run on the puny 9-volt bricks used by the Japanese. It required a battery pack that was roughly the size and weight of a loaf of lead. It was a massive, cardboard-encased brick of chemicals that cost a fortune and possessed the lifespan of a nervous hummingbird. When you loaded a full set of batteries into a Zenith, the device reached a level of density that could cause a local disturbance in the Earth's crust. Carrying a Zenith to a picnic was not a leisure activity, it was a logistical maneuver. You didn't just bring it along, you planned for it. You cleared a space in the trunk of the Buick, displacing the spare tire in the jack if necessary, and you carried it to the picnic site with both hands, your face turning a delicate shade of plum as you struggled to maintain a look of rugged adventure. By the time you reached the blanket, you were too exhausted to eat the potato salad, but you had the satisfaction of knowing that if a sudden gale blew up, the radio would remain exactly where you put it, even as the rest of the family was swept into the next county. The wise men at Zenith, led by the formidable Commander Eugene MacDonald, were convinced that the transistor was a fad. MacDonald was a man who enjoyed the finer things in life, yachts, expeditions, and the absolute authority of the vacuum tube. He believed that the American public would never trade the rich, warm, big city sound of a Zenith for the tinny, shivering screech of a Japanese pocket radio. "Quality!" he would cry, pounding his desk with a fist that had likely wrestled sharks. "The American man wants quality. He wants a radio that sounds like a symphony hall, not a hornet in a biscuit tin." He was right about the sound, of course. A Zenith transoceanic, when properly warmed up and tuned to a clear station, possessed a tone that was as smooth as 20-year-old bourbon. It breathed. It sang. It had a shortwave capability that allowed you to eavesdrop on the entire planet. You could hear the propaganda of the Soviets, the tangos of Argentina, and the Morse code of lonely ships at sea. It was a window into the soul of the world. But Commander MacDonald forgot one thing. The American man is fundamentally lazy. The dignity of weight is a fine thing to talk about in a showroom, but when a man has to carry his dignity up 3 flights of stairs or across a sandy beach, he begins to wonder if perhaps a little indignity might be easier on the knees. The Japanese radios were indignity personified. They were cheap, they were plastic, and they sounded like a whistle. But they weighed 6 ounces. You could put one in your pocket and forget it was there. You could not forget a Zenith was there. If you forgot a Zenith was there, it was usually because it had just fallen on your foot and broken 3 of your toes. The War of the Boat Anchors reached its climax in 1957 when Zenith finally realized that the transistor was not going away. In a move that must have felt like a betrayal of everything holy, they released the Royal 1000, the first transistorized transoceanic. It was a masterpiece of compromise. It replaced the heavy vacuum tubes with transistors, but because it was a Zenith, they couldn't bear to make it light. They encased it in a pound of chrome and black stag vinyl, and they kept the massive battery compartment. It still weighed 13 pounds. It was the world's first portable radio that could still be used as a blunt instrument in a tavern brawl. Zenith had successfully shrunk the technology, but they had refused to shrink the grandeur. They had built a transistor radio for men who hated transistor radios. I remember seeing a gentleman of my acquaintance, a man of high standing and even higher blood pressure, struggling down to the riverbank with a Royal 1000 in each hand. He looked like a man trying to balance two very small, very expensive boulders. "Going on an expedition, Colonel?" I asked, tipping my hat. "Just a bit of fishing, Mark," he panted, his eyes bulging. "I've got the new Zenith, transistorized, space age, can pick up the BBC from a rowboat." "And can you pick up the rowboat after you put the radio in it?" I inquired. "Or will the added weight send you straight to the bottom to join the catfish?" He didn't find the remark amusing. He was too busy trying to find a level spot on the mud where his boat anchor wouldn't sink out of sight. The Royal 1000 was a success, but it was the beginning of the end for the dignity of weight. The public had tasted the forbidden fruit of the pocket, and they were no longer willing to pay the physical price of the high-fidelity adventure. The Japanese were already working on radios the size of a matchbox, while Zenith was still trying to figure out how to make a transistor look like a piece of armored plating. The boat anchors eventually found their way into the attics and the basements, where they sat like silent, dusty monuments to an era when portable meant bring the mules. They are still there today, waiting for a new generation of collectors to rediscover the joy of a radio that can't be moved without a permit. Zenith had tried to save the world from the flimsy, but they had failed to realize that the world wanted to be flimsy. We wanted to be light. We wanted to be fast. We wanted to be able to hear the news without developing a hernia. Commander McDonald's heavy dream was defeated by a 6-ounce plastic beetle from Tokyo, and the dignity of weight was buried under a landslide of convenient, disposable, and perfectly weightless trash. It was a magnificent, heavy failure, and as I watch a modern man complain that his smartphone is a fraction of an ounce too heavy for his silk shirt, I can't help but wish I could drop a 1954 transoceanic into his lap just to remind him of what portable used to mean. Chapter 14. The Earphone and the Lonely Crowd. It has been my long-standing suspicion, one I have nurtured with the same care a gardener gives to a prize-winning pumpkin, that the ultimate goal of all human technological progress is to find a way to be in a crowded room without having to acknowledge that anyone else is there. We are a species that craves community in theory, yet finds the actual physical presence of our fellow man to be an irritating distraction from our own magnificent self-absorption. For centuries, we were hampered by the lack of a proper tool for this social surgery. If a man was in a crowd, he was forced to hear the crowd. He was subjected to the coughs, the sighs, the inanities, and the occasionally insightful but mostly tedious observations of his neighbors. Then came the earphone. Now, the earphone was not a new invention. It had existed for years In the dark, damp basements of the early telegraphers, and within the heavy stethoscopic headsets of the telephone girls who spent their days plugging the world's gossip into the world's switchboards. But in those days, it was a tool of labor, a badge of the working man. To wear an earphone was to announce that you were currently engaged in a task of some importance, or at least that you were being paid to listen to someone else's problems. But the transistor radio took this industrial accessory and turned it into a social weapon. Specifically, I speak of that tiny, white, plastic-covered earbud that began to appear in the ears of the American public like a new and particularly persistent breed of electronic fungus. This was the birth of the lonely crowd. The lonely crowd is a phrase used by sociologists, men who have dedicated their lives to describing the obvious in language that is intentionally opaque, to explain a world where people are packed together like sardines in a tin, yet each sardine is dreaming of a different ocean. The transistor radio provided the tin, but the earphone provided the dream. I have observed the arrival of this phenomenon on the streetcars and the buses of our great cities. In the old days, a bus was a place of communal suffering. We shared the smell of damp coats, the jolting of the suspension, and the occasional pleasantry about the weather. If a man spoke, you heard him. If a child cried, you endured it. We were a public. But with the arrival of the earphone, the public began to dissolve into a collection of privates. You would see a man sitting on a bench, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that didn't exist, with a thin black wire trailing from his ear down into the pocket of his coat. He looked for all the world like he was under medical supervision, or perhaps like a man who was receiving a direct, secret briefing from the War Department. He was, in fact, merely listening to a man in a studio 300 miles away describe the virtues of a new brand of floor wax. This was the glassy stare. It is a look of profound electronic vacancy. When a man has an earphone in, he is no longer there. You can speak to him, you can wave a hand in front of his face, you can even, if you are feeling particularly mischievous, suggest that his hat is on fire, and he will not respond. He is a ghost in a suit, a physical shell whose soul has been hijacked by a 9-volt battery and a germanium crystal. The earphone offered the most seductive humbug of all, the illusion of intimacy. When you listen to a radio in the parlor, the sound is a public event. It bounces off the walls, it mixes with the clinking of teacups, and it competes with the barking of the dog. But when the sound is piped directly into the ear canal, it becomes a private revelation. The voice of the announcer is no longer a man shouting into a microphone. He is a friend whispering directly into your brain. He is more real to you than the person sitting right next to you on the bus. I have seen a young lady sitting in a park, her face alight with a secret joy, laughing at a joke that no one else could hear. To the casual observer, she appeared to be losing her mind. To the initiated, she was simply transistorized. She had successfully banished the world, the trees, the birds, and the occasional wandering humorist, in favor of a tinny comedy routine being broadcast from a tower in Cincinnati. We became a nation of wiretappers on our own lives. The social impact of this was catastrophic. The earphone killed the hello and dealt a death blow to the good morning. Why would a man bother to exchange a pleasantry with a neighbor when he could be listening to the top 40? Why would he engage in the difficult, messy business of human conversation when he could have a perfectly curated, static-filled musical experience delivered straight to his eardrum? The earphone was the ultimate separator. It allowed us to be together while remaining apart. It turned the city into a collection of millions of tiny one-man theaters, each playing a different show, and each theater possessing a no trespassing sign in the form of a white plastic wire. The manufacturers, of course, understood this perfectly. They began to include an earphone with every radio, a personal listening device, they called it. It was usually a single mono earpiece, designed to fit in one ear while the other ear was left open to hear the sounds of oncoming traffic or the screams of one's neglected children. It was a masterpiece of half measures. It meant that a man was only half deaf to the world, which is a state of being that usually leads to getting hit by a milk truck while humming a catchy jingle about toothpaste. I find a profound and biting irony in the fact that we called this the communication age. We were building more wires, more towers, and more transmitters than at any time in history. Yet we were using them to ensure that we never had to communicate with the person standing 6 inches away from us. We were connected to a voice in a distant city, yet disconnected from the very ground we stood upon. The lonely crowd was not a tragedy to the people in it. It was a luxury. They paid for the privilege of being alone. They bought batteries to ensure that their isolation would not be interrupted by the sudden, terrifying arrival of a clear thought or a neighbor's greeting. I remember seeing an old man, a relic of the age of the porch and the parlor, watching a group of teenagers on a street corner. Each boy had an earphone in, and they were all nodding their heads in a synchronized, rhythmic trance, yet not one of them was looking at the others. "What are they doing?" the old man asked me, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Are they all deaf? Is it a new kind of medical treatment?" "No, sir," I replied. "They are merely modern. They are listening to the future, and the future apparently doesn't involve talking to one's friends." "But they're standing right next to each other," he cried. "If they have something to say, why don't they just say it?" "Because, my dear sir," I explained, "whatever they have to say cannot possibly compete with a man in a shiny suit singing about a hula hoop. The earphone has taught them that the intimate voice is always the one that comes through a wire, and that the public voice is merely an interruption." The old man shook his head and walked away, a man who still believed that a human voice was something intended to travel through the air rather than through a piece of copper and a plastic plug. The transistor war had moved into its most dangerous phase, the occupation of the head. We had surrendered our ears to the highest bidder, and the result was a world of glassy stares and electronic bubbles. We had finally achieved the ultimate dream of the misanthrope. We had found a way to be in a crowd without ever having to be with the crowd. And the cost? Only the death of the good morning and the slow, tinny erosion of the human soul, one 9-volt battery at a time. But as long as the music kept playing, nobody seemed to notice the silence growing between us. Chapter 15. The Numbers Game. 6 transistors versus 8. It has been my observation, through a lifetime of watching the human animal trade its dignity for a shiny gauntlet of lies, that nothing quite intoxicates a man like a large number. We are a species that lives by the ledger and dies by the digit. If you tell a man that a particular spring in Missouri possesses healing waters, he may be skeptical. But if you tell him those waters contain exactly 47 distinct minerals, each more unpronounceable than the last, he will travel 300 miles by mule just to gargle with the stuff. We have a profound, nearly religious conviction that more is synonymous with better, and that most is equivalent to divine. In the middle years of the transistorized era, this numerical madness found its ultimate expression in what I can only describe as the Great Semiconductor Counting War. As I have previously noted, the early radios were modest affairs. They contained 4 or perhaps 5 transistors, those little germanium pebbles that did the heavy lifting of turning a signal into a sound. These were the pioneers. But as the market grew crowded and the Japanese began to flood our shores with plastic boxes of every conceivable hue, the manufacturers realized that they could no longer sell a radio simply because it was portable. Every man on the street already had a pocket nuisance. To sell a new one, they needed a hook, and they found that hook in the transistor count. Suddenly, the front of every radio became a billboard for arithmetic. You would see it emblazoned in gold leaf across the plastic. 6 transistors. To the average American consumer, a man who couldn't tell a transistor from a trouser button if his life depended on it, this was a revelation. He didn't know what a transistor did, but he knew that 6 of them must be 50% more miraculous than 4. He would walk into a department store, ignore the 4-transistor model that sounded perfectly adequate, and plunk down an extra $10 for the 6-transistor version, convinced that he was purchasing a superior grade of reality. But the manufacturers, being men of high ambition and low scruples, did not stop at 6. Before the ink was dry on the advertisements for the 6, the 8 arrived, then the 10, then the 12. It was a numerical arms race that threatened to exhaust the world's supply of small integers. The radio had ceased to be a device for listening. It had become a scorecard. I have seen 2 gentlemen of otherwise sound mind standing on a street corner engaged in a battle of one-upmanship that would have shamed a pair of schoolboys comparing marbles. "Look at this," the first would say, producing a shiny red box with a flourish. "The new General Electric. 7 transistors." The second would sniff, a look of profound pity crossing his face as he reached into his own pocket. 7? How quaint. I've just upgraded to the Toshiba. 9 transistors, my boy. It can pull in signals from the very edges of the galaxy, or at least from the next county over. Neither man could hear a word the other was saying, of course, because both were currently broadcasting different ball games at a volume that could have startled a statue. But the sound was irrelevant. The number was the thing. The true genius and the true humbug of this era lay in the dark art of the dummy transistor. You see, a radio circuit is a disciplined thing. It only needs a certain number of transistors to function. To add more is often like adding a 5th leg to a horse. It doesn't make the horse faster, it just makes the horse more likely to trip over itself. But the public demanded more, and the manufacturers were only too happy to oblige. They began to pad the circuits. They would take a perfectly good 6-transistor radio and wire in 2 or 3 ornamental transistors, devices that were physically present in the box and perhaps even connected to a battery, but which did absolutely nothing to improve the sound. They were electronic hitchhikers. They were senator transistors, men who held a title and occupied a seat, but who never actually participated in the business of the state. I have spoken to an engineer, a man of sagging shoulders and a weary eye, who spent his days designing these mathematical frauds. "It's a disgrace, Mr. Twain," he sighed, poking at a circuit board with a soldering iron. "The marketing department came down this morning and told me the new model must have 12 transistors. I told them the circuit only requires 8. They told me to find a place for the other 4. So I've wired them in as diodes, or I've just stuck them in a corner where they can glow a bit and look busy. They don't do a lick of work, but we can print 12 on the box in 3-inch letters, and the public will buy them like hotcakes." This was the numbers game in its purest form. It was a masterpiece of human vanity. We were paying for a quantity of technology regardless of its quality. The multi-transistor radio became a status symbol. It was the tail fin of the pocket. Just as a man in 1959 felt he needed a Cadillac with wings large enough to facilitate a transatlantic flight, the teenager felt he needed a radio with enough transistors to calculate the trajectory of a moon rocket. I find a profound irony in the sound produced by these 12-transistor marvels. Despite the army of germanium rocks inside the casing, the sound remained stubbornly, magnificently tinny. You could have 100 transistors in a plastic box, but if they were still piped through a speaker the size of a silver dollar, the result was still going to sound like a hornet in a biscuit tin. But the American consumer is a creature of faith. He believed that if he could just get to 14 transistors, the tinny sound would magically transform into the rich, warm resonance of a pipe organ. He was perpetually 2 transistors away from perfection. The Japanese, sensing our weakness, took the game to its logical and absurd conclusion. They began to produce radios with numbers that defied common sense. They produced the all-transistor radio, a phrase that implies the device was composed of nothing but transistors, which would have made it a very expensive paperweight. They even produced radios where the transistors were visible through a clear plastic window, like the works of a clock, so that the owner could count his servants and feel his own importance grow with every digit. The numbers game eventually collapsed under its own weight, primarily because the public finally realized that a 12-transistor radio from a fly-by-night company sounded worse than a 6-transistor model from a reputable firm like Zenith or Sony. We discovered that a number is not a fact. It is merely a suggestion. But for a few glorious, crackling years, we were a nation of accountants. We lived by the count. We measured our social standing by the amount of germanium we carried in our pockets. We were advanced. We were modern. And we were remarkably easy to swindle, provided the swindler could count to 12. I remember seeing a young lad who had just purchased a radio with the number 16 emblazoned on the dial. He was holding it to his ear with an expression of such intense, intellectual rapture that I felt compelled to inquire as to the nature of his experience. "Is the music magnificent, son?" I asked. "I can't hear any music, Mr. Twain," he said, his voice trembling with pride. "The static is so loud it's nearly knocked my hat off. But just think, 16 transistors. Can you imagine the power it takes to make a noise this loud and this useless?" I could imagine it. I had seen it in politics. I had seen it in the pulpit. And now I was seeing it in the pocket. It was the ultimate triumph of the more over the better. The numbers game was a textbook example of the humbug in the electronic age. It proved that if you give a man a choice between a clear truth and a large, shiny lie, he will choose the lie every time, provided you tell him it's the newest model. The Mahogany monster was dead, and in its place we had a plastic box full of ornamental rocks and a 9-volt battery that was currently dying under the strain of powering 12 transistors that didn't have a job to do. It was a magnificent, expensive, and perfectly rhythmic stupidity. And the most frightening part? We were just getting started. The world was about to get a whole lot smaller, and the numbers were about to get a whole lot larger, until eventually we would be counting our transistors by the millions, and still wondering why we couldn't hear a word our neighbor was saying. Chapter 16. The Vanishing Tube Repairman. It has been my observation, gathered through a lifetime of watching the world trade its soul for a slightly faster way to get nowhere, that every great technological leap requires a human sacrifice. We do not offer up virgins to volcanoes anymore. We are far too civilized for such messy theatricals. Instead, we offer up the handyman. We take a class of men who possess the mystical ability to fix the world with a screwdriver and a well-placed kick, and we render them as obsolete as a flintlock in a machine gun fight. In the glorious mahogany-scented days of the vacuum tube, the neighborhood radio repairman was a figure of profound, nearly ecclesiastical authority. He was the local alchemist, a man who lived in a small dusty shop that smelled perpetually of singed dust, solder, and the ozone that accompanies a soul-searching electrical short. He was not a man of high fashion. He usually wore a shirt stained with coffee and the lifeblood of capacitors, but when your console radio began to groan like a dying hippopotamus, he was the only man who could stand between you and a weekend of absolute silence. To enter his shop was to enter a sanctuary of the broken. There were shelves piled high with the hollowed-out carcasses of radios that had given up the ghost, and boxes filled with the bottles of nothingness we called vacuum tubes. He would take your radio, lay it upon his workbench with the tenderness of a surgeon, and begin the diagnostic ritual. "It's the 12AX7, he would mutter, poking at the glowing innards with a wooden stick. "She's gone soft. Probably a leak in the grid." You didn't know what a 12AX7 was, and you certainly didn't know what a grid might be, but you nodded with the solemnity of a parishioner hearing a Latin Mass. You were in the presence of a man who could talk to the invisible. The most magnificent artifact of this era, however, was not the repairman himself, but his oracle, the pharmacy tube tester. In those days, nearly every drugstore in the Republic featured a massive, glowing machine that looked like a cross between a high-tech guillotine and a cathedral's pipe organ. When your radio failed, you didn't always call the repairman. First, you performed the ritual of the glass bottles. You would dismantle the back of your radio, a feat of engineering that usually resulted in 3 leftover screws and a lacerated thumb, and you would extract every glass tube in the chassis. You carried them to the pharmacy in a shoebox, cradling them as if they were the eggs of a prehistoric bird. Once there, you would stand before the tester. It featured 100 different sockets of varying sizes and a massive, illuminated dial with a needle that swung between good, weak, and replace. You would consult the Bible, a thick, grease-stained book attached to the machine by a chain to find the settings for your specific tube. You would flip switches, turn knobs, and then, with a trembling hand, press the test button. It was the only form of gambling the local clergy overlooked. If the needle swung to good, you felt a surge of relief that bordered on the spiritual. If it swung to replace, you were out $2.50, but you had the satisfaction of knowing you had identified the villain. It was a democratic form of science. Every man was his own engineer, and every shoebox was a laboratory. Then came the transistor. The transistor did not just shrink the radio, it murdered the repairable world. The transistor, you see, is a solid piece of rock. It does not glow. It does not get hot. It does not have a grid that can be poked or a glass envelope that can be replaced. It is a tiny black three-legged beetle that is soldered into a circuit board with a precision that defies the human hand. When a vacuum tube radio broke, it was a mechanical failure. A part had worn out. You could see it, you could smell it, and you could fix it. But when a transistor radio breaks, it is a metaphysical failure. The spirit of the signal has simply decided to depart the silicon, and there is nothing you can do to coax it back. The neighborhood repairman looked at the first Japanese pocket radios with a mixture of amusement and genuine horror. He opened the back of a Sony TR-63 and saw a world that had no room for his hands. The components were too small to see without a magnifying glass, and they were crowded together like passengers on a sinking life raft. There were no bottles to test. There were no glowing filaments to observe. "What is this?" he would growl, squinting through his jeweler's loupe. "It's a toy. It's not a radio. It's a conspiracy. There's nothing in here to fix. If one of these little rocks goes bad, you have to throw the whole thing in the river." He was right. This was the birth of the disposable era. The transistor radio was the first device that taught the American public the art of the trash can upgrade. In the old days, you kept a radio for 20 years. You mended it, you polished it, and you passed it down to your children like a family secret. But the transistor was so cheap and so impossible to repair that when it stopped hissing, you simply tossed it aside and bought another one. The repairman began to vanish. His shop, once the intellectual center of the block, became a dusty relic. The tube tester in the pharmacy was pushed into a corner to make room for a display of plastic sunglasses and instant cameras. The men who knew the secrets of the vacuum were replaced by technicians who wore clean uniforms and whose only skill was knowing which module to swap out and which warranty to ignore. We lost something profound in that transition. We lost the dignity of maintenance. A man who can fix his own radio is a man who understands his world. He is a participant in the machinery of his life. But a man who simply replaces his radio is a consumer, a passive, helpless creature who is entirely dependent on a factory 3,000 miles away. We became a nation of battery swappers and box discarders. We traded the joy of repair for the convenience of the new. I find a biting irony in the fact that we call this progress. We have created a world of invisible magic, devices that work perfectly until the exact moment they don't, at which point they become as useless as a glass hammer. We have surrounded ourselves with solid-state marvels that we cannot understand and certainly cannot mend. I remember seeing an old repairman, one of the last of his breed, sitting on a crate outside his shuttered shop. He was holding a small plastic transistor radio in his hand, turning it over and over as if it were a strange alien artifact. "Can't you fix it, Silas?" I asked. "Fix it?" he spat, tossing the radio into a nearby bin with a clatter of cheap plastic. "How do you fix a rock, Mark? How do you mend a thing that has no moving parts and no soul? It's a closed system. They built it so you can't get in, and they built it so you won't want to stay. The world has gone solid state, and there's no room left for a man with a screwdriver." He walked away, a ghost of the Victorian age, leaving the radio in the trash. The signal was still coming through the air, a tinny, distorted version of the truth, but there was no one left who knew how to catch it and clean it up. The vanishing tube repairman was the first casualty of the modern convenience. He was the man who kept the Mahogany monster alive, and when the monster died, he went with it. We are now a people who live in a world of black boxes, staring at screens we cannot fix, and listening to voices we cannot control, all while mourning the loss of a man who could tell us exactly what was wrong with the world just by the smell of a hot 12A X7. The tube tester is gone, the shoeboxes are empty, and the good, weak, replace dial of our civilization seems to be leaning alarmingly toward the red. But at least we have a radio in our pocket, and if it breaks, we can always buy another one for the price of a decent lunch. That, I suppose, is what they call the American dream, though it feels more like an electronic nightmare with no off switch. Chapter 17, The Era of Disposable Music. I have often remarked that the human race is the only animal that will pay good money for the privilege of being bored by the same thing 10,000 times in a single week, provided that thing is served up with a catchy beat and a rhythmic promise of eternal youth. In my day, a song was a thing of substance. If a melody survived long enough to be whistled by a riverboat pilot and groaned by a church choir, it was considered a standard. It had a shelf life longer than a smoked ham. You learned the lyrics, you hummed the tune for 40 years, and you eventually requested it at your funeral as a final melodic "I told you so" to your surviving relatives. But the transistor radio, in its infinite capacity for making the world smaller and significantly more frantic, birthed a new and terrifying phenomenon: disposable music. Before the noise box conquered the American pocket, music was a deliberate engagement. If you wanted to hear a particular tune, you either had to wait for the local brass band to sober up enough to play it, or you had to purchase a 78 record, a massive, fragile disc of shellac that was approximately the size of a dinner plate and possessed the structural integrity of a dried leaf. To play a 78 was a solemn ritual. You approached the phonograph with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar, carefully lowered the needle, and prayed that a passing breeze wouldn't shatter the record into 1,000 black shards. Then came the 45 RPM record. If the 78 was a meal, the 45 was a candy bar. It was a tiny, circular piece of black plastic with a hole in its heart, so large you could drive a small cat through it. It was cheap, it was durable, and it was designed to be played, scratched, and discarded with the same casual indifference one might show a used toothpick. And it found its perfect, tinny soulmate in the transistor radio. The two together created the Top 40 culture. This was a brand of musical Darwinism that would have made Mr. Darwin himself take up the banjo in protest. The Top 40 was a weekly horse race where the horses were made of cardboard, and the prize was 15 minutes of fame, followed by a lifetime of obscurity. I have watched the disc jockey, a figure of frantic caffeinated energy, preside over this carnival of the fleeting. He sits in a glass booth, surrounded by stacks of these little plastic donuts, and he broadcasts the hits with the desperate speed of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. And coming in at number 3, he screams, his voice crackling through the 2-inch speaker of 1,000,000 transistors. It's the new sensation by the Four-Legged Whistlers. It's been on the charts for 3 weeks, and it's heading for the top. Listen to it now, before it's replaced by something even more irritating in 20 minutes. The hit was no longer a piece of art. It was a commodity. It was a sound. And because the transistor radio possessed the acoustic fidelity of a hornet in a biscuit tin, the sound didn't have to be good. It just had to be loud. The manufacturers discovered that if you added enough echo, enough distorted guitar, and a beat that mimicked the thumping of a frantic heart, the public would buy it by the millions. They didn't care that they couldn't hear the lyrics. Most of the lyrics were about going to the hop or losing one's mind over a girl named Sue, and were better left unheard. They only cared that it was the song of the moment. This was the era of the one-hit wonder. A young man could emerge from a garage in Ohio, record a song that sounded like a steam engine having a nervous breakdown, hear it played 6 times an hour on every transistor in the Republic for 14 days, and then vanish so completely that his own mother wouldn't recognize him in a police lineup. The music was designed for the now. It was intended to be consumed in a car, on a beach, or under a school desk, and then tossed into the mental trash can the moment the next plastic donut arrived from the factory. I find a profound and biting irony in the portability of this music, because you could take the music with you to the beach. The music became part of the scenery. It was as transient as the tide and as disposable as a paper cup. In the old days, you went to the music. Now, the music followed you around like a persistent and rather dim-witted beggar. We became a nation of hook hunters. We didn't want a symphony. We wanted a 3-second fragment of melody that we could hum while waiting for the bus. We wanted the big beat. We were training our brains to function in 3-minute increments, punctuated by commercials for hair tonic and laundry soap. The transistor radio was the engine of this shortened attention span, a mechanical device that ensured we would never have to endure the burden of a long thought or a complex harmony. I recall seeing a group of youngsters huddling over a radio at a soda fountain. They were listening to a song that seemed to consist entirely of the word "yeah," repeated 48 times to the accompaniment of a tambourine. "Is that a magnificent composition, boys?" I inquired, leaning against the counter. "It's a smash, Mr. Twain," one of them replied, his eyes glazed with the rhythmic fever of the era. "It's the #1 song in the country. Everyone's listening to it." "And will you be listening to it next year?" I asked. He looked at me with the blank, uncomprehending stare of a man who has just been asked to explain the fourth dimension. "Next year? Why would I do that? There'll be a new #1 song next year. This one's just for today." Therein lies the tragedy of the transistor. It turned music into today's news. It stripped the melody of its permanence and the artist of his dignity. We were building a civilization of the ephemeral. We were trading the mahogany monster and its deep, resonant truth for a plastic box and a tinny, disposable lie. The record companies, of course, were delighted. They realized that if they could make music disposable, they could sell the same person 50 records a year instead of one. They invented the flip side, the song on the back of the 45 that was usually so atrocious it was used primarily as a place for the needle to rest. They invented the picture sleeve, a piece of colorful paper that was often more interesting than the music inside. They were selling the sizzle, and the public was happily chewing on the cold plastic steak. I find it a magnificent humbug. We have more music in our pockets than a Victorian emperor had in his entire palace, yet we value it less than a cheap cigar. We have replaced the hymn with the jingle and the aria with the shout. We are a people who live in a constant vibrating present, where the past is forgotten and the future is just another 9-volt battery away. The era of disposable music was the first sign that we were becoming a throwaway society. We were learning that if something was broken or boring or simply a week old, the solution was not to mend it or to understand it, but to discard it and buy the new and improved version. The transistor radio was the teacher, and we were the star pupils. As I watch the top 40 countdown every week, I can't help but think of the millions of little plastic donuts piling up in the landfills of history. Each one a #1 smash, each one a sensation, and each one now as silent and forgotten as a politician's promise after an election. We have achieved the ultimate goal of the modern age. We are surrounded by noise, yet we have absolutely nothing to say that will last until Tuesday. But as long as the battery holds out, and as long as the DJ keeps screaming, we can pretend that the noise is the same thing as a life. It isn't, of course, but it's much more portable, and it fits perfectly in a shirt pocket. Chapter 18. How Japan Shrank the World. It has been my observation, gleaned from a lifetime of watching the human race try to outrun its own shadow, that the American mind is fundamentally incapable of understanding the concept of enough. We are a people of the Great Plains, the Great Lakes, and the Great Big Lie. We equate greatness with gross tonnage. If a man builds a house, he wants it to have enough spare rooms to house a small army of indigent relatives. If he buys a car, he wants it to be long enough to require a tugboat to navigate a street corner. Our national motto is not "A pluribus unum." It is "Make it bigger and put some chrome on it." In the years following the great unpleasantness of the 1940s, we stood upon the world stage like a colossus in a silk suit. We had the biggest factories, the loudest voices, and the most cavernous parlors. We looked at the rest of the world with the pitying indulgence a man might show to a neighbor who is still using a mule to plow a suburban garden. We assumed that the future would be a continuation of the present, only with more mahogany, more steel, and more buttons to push. Then came the Japanese, and they did something so fundamentally un-American that it nearly caused a collective nervous breakdown in the halls of Congress. They made the world small. Now, to an American, small is a synonym for failure. If a man is small-minded, he is a scoundrel. If a business is small-time, it is a joke. We spent our engineering genius trying to make the vacuum tube more powerful, which is like trying to make a steam engine more energetic, by building it out of solid gold. We were convinced that the solid-state revolution would simply allow us to build even bigger and more complex machines. But the Japanese, led by those two masters of the miniature miracle, Morita and Ibuka, looked at the world through the other end of the telescope. They didn't see the transistor as a way to make the big things better. They saw it as a way to make the big things disappear. They lived, after all, on a series of islands where space was not a geographical fact, but a luxury. In Japan, if you have a square inch of dirt, you don't put a parking lot on it. You grow a miniature tree, compose a poem about it, and then invite 3 neighbors over for tea in a room the size of a cigar box. They were a civilization that had spent centuries perfecting the art of the dense. They knew how to pack a mountain of meaning into a molehill of material. When they turned their attention to the radio, they didn't just shrink the components, they shrank the mindset. I recall the first time I saw a truly Japanese-sized device. It was not like the American portables, which, as I have noted, were essentially suitcases with a grudge. This was a sliver of plastic and germanium that looked like it had been stolen from a dollhouse. It was so light it felt as though it might float away if you didn't hold it down with a heavy thought. "Is it a toy?" I asked the man who was demonstrating it, a fellow with a nervous twitch and a collection of New Age neckties. "It is a radio, Mr. Twain," he cried, his voice trembling with a sort of miniature ecstasy. "It has 6 transistors. It can fit in your palm. It can hide in your shoe. You can carry the entire world in your pocket and never even know it's there." "And why," I inquired, "would I want to carry the world in my pocket if I'm never to know it's there? If I have a world in my pocket, I should at least like it to occasionally announce its presence by weighing something." But the public didn't want weight. They wanted the humbug of the invisible. Japan's true victory was not in the laboratory, but in the silhouette. They realized that the modern man didn't want to be an owner of furniture. He wanted to be a user of gadgets. A gadget is a thing that does not require a home. It is a parasite of the person. By shrinking the radio, Japan liberated it from the parlor and tethered it to the human body. They turned the citizenry into a collection of walking, vibrating antennas. This was the birth of the transistorized lifestyle. Suddenly, everything began to contract. The cameras grew smaller, the lighters grew thinner, and the very ideas of the era began to be served up in bite-sized portions. We were no longer a nation that sat down to read a 3-volume history of the Peloponnesian War. We were a nation that wanted the summary on a 3x5 card that could be read while running for a train. We were shrinking our attention spans to match the size of our speakers. The American manufacturers, the titans at RCA, Zenith, and Admiral, watched this shrinkage with the horror of a man watching his bank account evaporate. They tried to compete, but they couldn't help themselves. They kept trying to make the small things dignified. They would take a transistor circuit and encase it in a pound of chrome and genuine simulated leather, thereby ensuring that it was still too heavy to be comfortable. They were trying to fight a war of lightness with heavy weapons. The Japanese, meanwhile, were embracing the flimsy. They understood that if you make a thing cheap enough and small enough, the consumer won't care if it's made of plastic that smells like a burning tire. He will buy it because it is convenient, and convenience is the most dangerous word in the English language. It is the bait that has led more men to ruin than the promise of free beer. I find a profound and biting irony in the geopolitical outcome of this shrinkage. We had spent 4 years and billions of dollars defeating Japan in a war of battleships, bombers, and industrial might. We had proven that our large was more powerful than their small. Yet, a mere 15 years later, they were conquering our homes, our pockets, and our very ears with devices that cost $30 and were powered by a battery. They didn't need a navy. They had Sony. They didn't need a standing army. They had an army of salesmen with trick pockets. They shrank the world by making the distance between here and elsewhere irrelevant. In the old days, if you wanted to know what was happening in London, you had to wait for a ship to arrive or for a telegram to be delivered and then read aloud in the town square. With the Japanese transistor, London was in your ear while you were standing in a cornfield in Iowa. The world was no longer a vast, mysterious expanse. It was a tinny, crackling neighborhood. But there is a cost to shrinking the world. When you make the world small enough to fit in your pocket, you lose the majesty of the horizon. You lose the sense that there are places so far away and so different that they cannot be understood through a 2-inch speaker. You trade the awe of the unknown for the boredom of the instant. We became a nation of global citizens who knew everything that was happening everywhere, yet understood nothing of what was happening right in front of our own noses. We were connected to Tokyo, Paris, and New York, but we were increasingly disconnected from the man sitting across the aisle from us on the bus. Japan had achieved a miracle of engineering, but they had also facilitated a catastrophe of the spirit. They had made the world handy, and in doing so, they had made it trite. The great big world of my youth, a world of steamships, long letters, and slow, thoughtful journeys, had been folded up, compressed, and sold back to us in a plastic box that fits in a shirt pocket. I remember seeing an advertisement for a Japanese radio that showed a man standing on top of a mountain holding his pocketable device to the sky. The caption read, "The whole world in your hand." I looked at that man and I felt a great surge of pity. He had the whole world in his hand, true enough. But because it was so small, he could no longer see the mountain he was standing on. He was too busy listening to the static from 1,000 miles away to notice the wind in the pines or the silence of the peaks. Japan had shrunk the world, and we had happily paid the price of admission. We were now mobile, modern, and miniaturized. We were small men in a small world, clutching our small boxes and wondering why, with all this communication, we had never felt quite so alone. The Mahogany monster was a beast, to be sure, but at least it stayed in the corner and let you be a man. The Japanese beetle followed you everywhere, whispering in your ear that the world was just a series of tinny vibrations, and that the most important thing in life was to make sure you didn't lose your 9-volt battery. It was a magnificent, diminutive conquest. And as I watched the world continue to shrink into the microchips and nano-miracles of the coming age, I can't help but wish for a bit of the old American standard. I want a world that is too big to fit in a pocket, a world that requires a man to look up, look out, and occasionally, for the love of all that is holy, to turn the off knob and just sit in the silence of the great, big, unshrunk universe. Chapter 19. The Walkman, the Transistor's Final Child. It has been my observation, having spent several decades watching the human animal attempt to outwit its own shadow, that the ultimate ambition of the species is to become a human island. We are born into a world of unavoidable neighbors, noisy relatives, and the persistent, irritating reality of other people's opinions. And we spend the remainder of our lives trying to find a door that we can lock from the inside. We have tried walls, we have tried fences, and we have tried the mahogany monster of the parlor. But none of these could quite solve the problem of the shared atmosphere. Even the transistor radio, for all its portability, was a leaky vessel. It broadcast its tinny racket to everyone within a 10-foot radius, thereby inviting the very social interaction it was designed to help us avoid. But in the year of our Lord 1979, the gentlemen at Sony, the same alchemists of the Japanese beetle I have previously described, unveiled the final, devastating weapon in the war against communal sanity, the Walkman. If the transistor radio was the engine of insurrection, the Walkman was the hermetic seal. It was the transistor's final, most peculiar child, a device that did not merely bring music into the world, but successfully removed the world from the music. It was a small, silver and blue plastic brick that did not catch voices from the air, but rather digested a plastic noodle known as the cassette tape. Now, I have seen many forms of intellectual ballast in my time, but the cassette tape is a masterpiece of the flimsy. It consists of 2 tiny reels of brown magnetic tape encased in a shell that possesses the structural integrity of a cheap soap dish. If you looked at it cross-eyed, the tape would nest or tangle, emerging from the machine in a chaotic, spaghetti-like heap that required a man to spend 40 minutes with a number 2 pencil and a great deal of profanity to wind it back into its cage. Yet this was the software of the new age. The Walkman was designed by a man who, I suspect, had reached the absolute limit of his tolerance for human conversation. Legend has it that Masaru Ibuka wanted a way to listen to opera on long airplane flights without having to endure the snoring of his fellow passengers or the chatter of the stewardess. It was an invention born of a desire for absolute isolation. The device came with a set of headphones, not the single white earbud of the 50s, which left one ear open to the warnings of oncoming carriages, but a 2-eared padded contraption that formed a complete, unyielding barrier between the wearer and the universe. When you put on the Walkman, you were not merely listening, you were occupied. I have watched the arrival of the Walkman generation with a mixture of awe and genuine biological concern. It created a new subspecies of humanity, the pedestrian ghost. In the old days, a man walking down the street was a participant in the geography of his town. He saw the shops, he heard the horses, and he occasionally exchanged a nod with a neighbor. He was present. But the Walkman wearer is a creature who is physically in Pittsburgh while his brain is currently experiencing a heavy metal concert in London. He walks with a peculiar rhythmic gait, the Walkman strut, bobbing his head to a beat that no one else can hear, like a man possessed by a very private and very rhythmic demon. His eyes possess the glassy stare I have previously mentioned, but it has now reached its final terminal stage. He does not see the red light. He does not see the open manhole. He does not see the runaway milk truck. He only sees the vibe. I recall seeing a young lad stepping off a curb in San Francisco, his ears encased in orange foam, his face alight with a secret internal glory. A cable car was clanging its bell with enough vigor to wake the inhabitants of a cemetery. But the lad didn't flinch. He was listening to a man named Iggy Pop, and as far as he was concerned, the cable car was merely a figment of a boring, unsoundtracked reality. "Son," I bellowed, grabbing him by the scruff of his neck, just as the iron wheels threatened to turn him into a two-dimensional souvenir. "The world is trying to speak to you. It is saying that you are about to be flattened." He pulled the headphones down around his neck, and a tiny hissing sound emerged from the foam, a noise like a swarm of angry gnats participating in a drum solo. "What?" he asked, looking at me as if I were a ghost from a prehistoric era. "I was just getting to the good part." "The good part of your life is likely to be the part where you aren't under a tram," I remarked. He didn't listen. He snapped the foam back over his ears and vanished into the crowd, nodding his head to his private plastic noodle. He was the sovereign of the sidewalk, a man who had decided that the soundtrack of his life was more important than the life itself. The Walkman completed the transition that the noise box began. It made music individual, private, and total. The loss of serendipity. In the age of the radio, you heard what the airwaves gave you. You encountered the unexpected. You might be looking for a ball game and find a sermon. You might be looking for jazz and find a lecture on the mating habits of the North American beaver. It was a chaotic democratic experience. But with the Walkman, you chose your tape. You curated your own boredom. You ensured that you would never, ever be surprised by a thought that you hadn't already approved in advance. The death of the soundscape. We began to treat the sounds of the world, the wind in the trees, the laughter of children, the clinking of glasses, as interference. We decided that the natural world lacked a decent baseline. The leakage of the senses. There is a particular snobbery to the Walkman. The wearer believes he is in a silent bubble, but those of us standing next to him are subjected to the tinny leak. It is a high-frequency, rhythmic tish that is just loud enough to be irritating, yet just quiet enough to prevent you from actually enjoying the melody. It is the electronic equivalent of a neighbor who insists on humming a song he doesn't quite know while you are trying to read a book. I find a profound irony in the name, Walkman. It suggests a man who is walking, which is a social, physical, and outward-facing activity. In truth, it should have been called the hide man or the go-away man. It was the ultimate do not disturb sign worn right on the temples. The manufacturers, sensing that they had finally found a way to sell silence by filling it with noise, began to produce the Walkman in every conceivable configuration. There were sports models for people who wanted to ignore their own exhaustion. There were pro models for people who wanted to ignore their colleagues with a higher degree of fidelity. The battery makers, those merchant princes I have previously described, were in a state of perpetual ecstasy. The Walkman was a double-A glutton. It ate batteries with the voracity of a Missouri hog in a cornfield. We were now a nation of unplugged nomads. We had successfully disconnected ourselves from the mains of the wall, and now we had disconnected ourselves from the mains of human society. We were mobile, we were personal, and we were utterly magnificently unreachable. I remember seeing a couple sitting on a park bench, a young man and a young woman ostensibly on a date. In the old days, they would have been whispering sweet nothings into each other's ears, or perhaps engaging in a spirited debate about the merits of a local politician. But these two both had Walkman, They were sitting side by side, their heads bobbing at different speeds, their ears encased in plastic. They were together, yet they were inhabiting two different universes, separated by a thin piece of magnetic tape. "Is this the future of romance?" I asked a passing policeman. "It's the future of everything, Mr. Twain," he sighed, adjusting his cap. "At least they aren't arguing. It's hard to have a domestic dispute when you can't hear the other person's insults over the sound of a synthesizer." It was a triumph of technology over the messiness of life. We had finally found a way to be alone in a crowd, and we had done it by turning our heads into a pair of plastic cages. The transistor's final child had grown up, and it had decided that it didn't want to talk to its parents, its neighbors, or the world at large. It just wanted to hear the same 12 songs until the batteries died and the silence returned. A silence that, by now, was the most terrifying sound of all. The war of the transistor was over. The personal had won, and the world was left standing on the curb, ringing its bell, while we all walked into the traffic, nodding our heads to a beat that was entirely and tragically our own. Chapter 20. The Warm-Up Period and the Lost Art of Thinking. It has been my observation, having spent a fair portion of my life watching the human race scramble to save a second here and a minute there, that man is the only creature who will move heaven and earth to gain 5 minutes of spare time, only to spend those 5 minutes wondering what on earth to do with them. We are obsessed with speed, as if the swifter we travel toward the grave, the more magnificent the journey must be. We have traded the stagecoach for the locomotive, the letter for the telegram, and, most tragically, the warm-up period for the instant on. In the stately, mahogany-shrouded days of the vacuum tube, there was a physical and moral barrier between a man and his noise. This barrier was known as the warm-up. As I have previously noted, when you turned the brass knob of a console radio, nothing happened for a good 3 minutes. The tubes had to glow. The filaments had to reach a state of incandescent readiness. The bottles of nothingness had to be coaxed into their electronic labor. To the modern transistorized mind, this wait is a catastrophe, a 3-minute void in the universe that must be filled with a lawsuit or a nervous breakdown. But to a man of sense, that 3-minute delay was a gift of Providence. It was a liturgical intermission. It was a space of time in which a human being was forced to do that most difficult and unfashionable of things. He was forced to think. You see, thinking is a slow, cumbersome business. It does not run on a 9-volt battery, and it cannot be triggered by a flick of a plastic switch. It requires a certain amount of warm-up of its own. In the old days, while the radio was gathering its strength, you sat in the silence of the parlor and you reflected. You wondered if you really wanted to hear the news from the Capitol. You pondered whether you were in the right frame of mind for a symphony. You reconsidered whether that third helping of peach cobbler was a wise tactical move. The warm-up period was the mental break of civilization. It provided a moment of pause before the arrival of the world's chaos. It gave you time to prepare your soul for the onslaught of other people's opinions. But the transistor changed all that. The transistor is the instant-on devil. When you flick the switch on a Sony or a Zenith, the noise is there before your finger has even left the dial. There is no pause. There is no reflection. There is no 3-minute grace period in which a man can realize he is about to listen to something remarkably stupid and decide to go for a walk instead. The transistor bypassed the human filter. It realized that if you give a man enough time to think, he might choose silence. But if you give him the noise instantly, he will swallow it whole, like a hungry catfish swallowing a baited hook. This was the death of the lost art of thinking. I have observed that as the world has gotten faster, it has gotten progressively shallower. We have swapped the deep well of contemplation for the puddle of the instant. We no longer have thoughts. We have reactions. We don't ponder the news. We are vibrated by it. The transistor radio ensured that there was never a gap in the racket, never a hole in the static, and never a moment where a man was left alone with the terrifying company of his own mind. I find it a profound irony that we call this the information age. We are flooded with information, yes, tinny, crackling, portable information, but we are remarkably short on wisdom. Wisdom requires a vacuum tube. It requires heat, it requires time, and it requires a certain amount of mahogany-scented patience. Information, on the other hand, is a transistorized commodity. It is cheap, it is fast, and it possesses the nutritional value of a handful of sawdust. I recall seeing a man in a modern office, a place filled with clicking machines and men who appeared to be in a state of permanent, low-level panic. He had a small radio on his desk, and he kept it on from the moment he arrived until the moment he fled. "Why do you keep that thing running, Silas?" I asked. "Don't you find the static distracting?" "Distracting?" he said, looking at me with a bewildered expression. "I can't work without it, Mr. Twain. The silence, it makes me nervous. I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like the world is going on without me." "And if the world is going on without you," I replied, "is that such a terrible thing? Perhaps the world would benefit from a bit of your absence, and you would certainly benefit from a bit of the world's silence." He didn't understand. He couldn't. He had lost the ability to warm up. His mind was always on, always receptive to the latest vibration, always twitching to the beat of a distant drum. He had become a solid-state man, fast, efficient, and entirely lacking in a soul. The warm-up period was the last remnant of a world that understood that some things are worth waiting for. A good meal, a good book, and a good radio broadcast all require a certain amount of preparation. If you take away the preparation, you take away the value by making the radio instant. We made the content inconsequential. We decided that the act of listening was more important than the object being listened to. We have become a nation of channel surfers and dial twisters. We are perpetually looking for the new thing, the next station, the clearer signal, never realizing that the problem isn't the signal. The problem is our own inability to sit still and listen to a single thing all the way through. We have the attention span of a grasshopper on a hot griddle, and the transistor radio is the griddle. I look back at the Mahogany monster with a certain degree of affection now, which is a state of mind I never thought I would achieve. It was a beast, it was a tyrant, and it smelled of hot dust, but it was an honest machine. It told you, in no uncertain terms, that if you wanted to hear the world, you had to pay the price of 3 minutes of your own time. It respected you enough to give you a moment to change your mind. The transistor does not respect you. It views you as a market. It wants your ear It wants your battery money, and it wants your absolute undivided lack of attention. It has succeeded beyond its wildest dreams. We are now a world of instant-on inhabitants, carrying our noise in our pockets, our ears in our cars, perpetually connected and perpetually confused. The lost art of thinking has been buried under a landslide of plastic and germanium. We have conquered the warm-up, and in doing so, we have chilled the human spirit. We are fast, we are portable, and we are perfectly weightless. As I watch the digital miracles of the coming age, those tiny glowing slabs of glass that make the transistor radio look like a horse and buggy, I can't help but wish for a bit of the old delay. I want a machine that makes me wait. I want a world that doesn't answer me until I've had time to remember what the question was. I want 3 minutes of silence, a glowing orange light, and the distinct smell of a vacuum tube coming to life. But that world is gone. The warm-up is a memory, and the lost art of thinking is a ghost. We have achieved the ultimate goal of progress. We have found a way to be constantly entertained while having absolutely nothing to think about. It is a triumph of engineering, a masterpiece of convenience, and a total catastrophe of the human character. And the most frightening part of all? The battery is full, the signal is clear, and we've forgotten how to turn the knob to off.